Blood trickled slowly across the cold floor, marking the end of a brutal confrontation. Words about the Empire and noble titles echoed in the heavy air. The knight screamed in agony as the blade pierced his chest, sealing his fate in that fatal instant. His opponent watched the scene intently, uttering words that sounded like a final judgment on the hero's legacy. The wounded man, his face scarred, heard the sentence as he felt his life quickly draining away. That was the end of Sir Bartle, the renowned phantom swordsman, definitively defeated in battle. His lifeless body fell to the stone floor. The victor remained standing, declaring that this sacrifice was necessary for the good of the Empire. A sadistic, blood-stained smile curved the assassin's lips, satisfied with the violent outcome. The light in the victim's eyes went out completely, leaving only the silent emptiness of death. The fatal wound glowed with a strange energy, consuming the fallen warrior's last breath. However, consciousness was not lost in eternal darkness. Instead, it awoke in a calm environment, before the pages of a book. The protagonist realized, frustrated, that even reading was an arduous task in that small, fragile child's body. Looking out the window, young Dale was still surprised whenever he reflected on the strange twist that fate had in store for him. The memories of his previous life, including his past as master of the Dark Tower, were still vivid in his mind. He had been reincarnated into the boy's body, preserving all his memories and consciousness, although he had no control over where he would be reborn. Surrounded by visions of his undead servants, he decided that he would not waste this unique opportunity. It was time to enjoy his new existence. The young man swore a bloody revenge against the Empire, smiling with a menacing confidence in the face of his new goal. Meanwhile, Duke Saxon, known as Lord Black and master of the Black Magic Tower, reviewed important documents. A knock on the door interrupted his concentration. Without taking his eyes off the papers, the nobleman allowed entry. Officer Sephia, an elder of the Blue Tower, entered the room. Visibly nervous in the imposing presence of her superior, she reported the recent progress. The young master had managed to manipulate mana and successfully engrave his first magic circle. The boy had demonstrated an immediate talent, conjuring an ice bolt spell during training. However, the officer hesitated to continue the report. The power of that attack was unexpected for a beginner. The shot was strong enough to take the life of a small creature instantly. The Duke listened to the report with his arms crossed, maintaining a stern and impenetrable expression while assessing the information. Later, on the training ground, the father instructed his son on the absolute necessity of mental control in necromancy. The boy agreed humbly. Preparing for practice, the protagonist closed his eyes and let out a long sigh to calm his mind and focus. He extended his hands over the dead animal, channeling energy to activate the complex resurrection circle. A mystical light emanated from the ground, connecting the necromancer to the target of his spell as the power flowed. The effort began to take effect as the creature's paws moved spasmodically, indicating the return of animation. The young man concentrated all his willpower, sweating profusely to keep the flow of magic stable and complete the ritual. The spell seemed to have worked. The small creature was there, sitting and apparently whole again. The young man wiped the sweat from his forehead, exhausted by the consumption of mana. His father watched the result in silence, assessing the success. He reached out to touch his creation. However, the animal recoiled instinctively at the gesture. The creature hopped away across the training ground. There was something unnatural and erratic about its movements. Duke Saxon narrowed his eyes. He immediately realized that the resurrection contained a fundamental flaw. Suddenly, the animal's body began to collapse. An unstable energy ran through the small form as it tried to flee. The magic went out of control. Ice crystals exploded violently from the inside out, consuming the target. The boy watched the scene, surprised. The sudden destruction was not part of his initial calculations. Only fragments of ice remained floating in the air. The physical receptacle could not withstand the density of the power invoked. However, surprise soon gave way to understanding. He did not feel defeated by the failure of the experiment. On the contrary, a manic smile spread across his face. That destructive power was exactly what he desired to master. Time passed, bringing maturity and new equipment. He was no longer just an inexperienced child. The protagonist now walked with confidence, enveloped in an aura of fully developed dark magic. Elsewhere, brutal creatures waited in the darkness. Their eyes gleamed with murderous intent. A cornered soldier trembled in terror. Surrounded by the monsters, he knew his end was near. The soldier trembled uncontrollably, tears of dread streaming down his face. The fear of imminent death paralyzed his senses, leaving him without any hope of escape. He gritted his teeth and squeezed his eyes shut, awaiting the final blow. The anguish was so intense that time seemed to freeze in that instant of terror. Suddenly, the creature's attention was diverted by something unexpected. Before they could react, blades of energy sliced through the air, surprising the brutal monsters. In a fluid motion, the orcs' heads were separated from their bodies. The protagonist descended upon them like a storm, enveloped in lethal arcs of violet magic. Covered in the enemy's green blood, the soldier stared at the scene, stunned. He could barely process that the threat had been eliminated so quickly. The young mage, however, turned to him with a friendly and carefree smile. He seemed to treat that violent massacre as a simple morning stroll. But the interaction was brief and strange. The protagonist walked right past the man he had just saved, walking among the remaining monsters with total indifference. The soldier's relief turned into confusion and a new kind of fear. He realized that the young master's expression had changed to absolute coldness as soon as he turned his back. Saxon raised his hand, materializing sharp ice crystals in the air. He seriously considered the pragmatic idea of eliminating everyone around him, all at once to save effort. The scene changed drastically to training in the castle. A sharp blade stopped millimeters from the protagonist's neck, wielded with precision by a young knight. She called him by name, Saxon, maintaining a firm posture and a stern look. The woman demanded explanations for his behavior, clearly dissatisfied with something he had said. Upon hearing the mention of a specific title, the young man hesitated visibly. The reference to the Holy Swordsman made him break out in a cold sweat, demonstrating the weight that name carried. The image of Count Brandenburg, the legendary warrior, arose imposingly in the context of the conversation. His reputation as the strongest was something that commanded immediate respect. However, the apprehension was short-lived. A sinister smile curved Saxon's lips as his dark energy emanated, revealing a malicious excitement in the face of the challenge. The monstrous creature emerged from the shadows famished. Its presence heralded an imminent massacre for anyone who crossed its path. The battlefield plunged into absolute chaos. The soldiers fought desperately, firing at a horde that seemed infinite and relentless. Panic gripped one of the men. He realized too late that death was coming from above, and there was nowhere to run. The blow was brutal and decisive. There was no chance of defense as blood stained the air, marking the end of yet another life. A colossal shadow loomed over the survivor. The overwhelming pressure of that evil presence forced him to kneel, helpless. He faced the end with wide eyes. Fear completely paralyzed him, leaving him unable to react to the sharp point aimed at his face. The execution was quick and merciless. His life instantly vanished, his body falling without any resistance to the ground. Nearby, another soldier witnessed the carnage. The enemy wasted no time and advanced against him with lethal speed. The beast displayed an evil look, seeming to revel in the destruction and terror it spread among the human ranks. However, this combatant reacted in time. With quick reflexes, the soldier moved to intercept the deadly onslaught from the shadows. The clash was violent. He blocked the attack with his blade, refusing to suffer the same tragic fate as his comrades. The force of the impact, however, was overwhelming. The soldier was thrown backward, colliding violently against the structure. Cornered against the wall, he maintained his composure. The soldier raised his firearm, focused only on surviving that nightmare. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. A shot illuminated the darkness in a last and desperate attempt at defense. The sound of the shot echoed, mixing with the screams and destruction that consumed the place, while the soldier's fate remained uncertain. The commander turned sharply, noticing a change in the atmosphere. His survival instincts, sharpened by previous battles, alerted him to a new danger. Beside him, the other soldier seemed paralyzed. The terror etched on his face revealed that the situation had completely spiraled out of control in the face of the threat. The shooter, however, remained focused. His gloved fingers tightened on the rifle with determination, preparing for the imminent confrontation. While his companion fired frantically to contain the advance of the shadows, the protagonist maintained his position, seeking a clear target amidst the chaos of battle. The monstrous creature rose, gigantic and relentless. After so many losses, only that small group remained, desperately resisting total annihilation. A massive tentacle descended violently, seeking to crush him. The soldier had to react in a split second, dodging the beast's lethal attack. Suddenly, the war zone was invaded by a golden light. A complex magic circle materialized, shining intensely behind the combatant. The man's eyes widened, taken by absolute surprise. That mystical energy did not belong to the battlefield he knew. The glow intensified, completely enveloping him. Meanwhile, his ally continued to fire at the monsters, oblivious to the phenomenon that was swallowing his companion. The weapon was left behind as the light consumed him. The shooter disappeared from the devastated world, abruptly removed from the deadly combat. In a completely different place, golden and shining chains emerged from the darkness, moving with a will of their own to capture their target. The soldier reappeared suspended in the air, immobilized by magic. Below him, a group of hooded figures celebrated the success of the ritual, believing they had finally summoned the legendary hero. Confused and furious with the sudden change, the soldier tried to resist. He reached out and fought against the energy that held him, refusing to be contained. An elder in long robes calmly approached the circle. He watched the captured man with a mixture of reverence and satisfaction for the feat achieved. The light bonds tightened around the neck and torso of the summoned one. The soldier was now immobile, at the mercy of those strange people in an unknown world. The elder closed his eyes momentarily, concentrating on the final stage of the ritual he had begun. The soldier, still dazed by the abrupt change of environment, tried to shout, demanding answers about what was happening. However, the mage did not tolerate the interruption. With an authoritative gesture and a single word of command, he ordered absolute silence. Immediately, a restriction oath was activated. The soldier felt an oppressive magic strike him, silencing his voice by force. Intense pain ran through his body as chains of energy immobilized him. He screamed in agony, unable to resist the power that subjugated him. The summoner kept his hand raised, manipulating the complex magic circle to ensure that the prisoner remained under total control. The young man gritted his teeth, fighting against the overwhelming pressure, but the magic was too strong to be broken with willpower alone. Next to the leader, one of the hooded figures held the sword that the combatant had brought with him, treating the weapon as a mere curious object. The blade was then discarded without ceremony onto the runic circle on the ground, sealing the complete disarmament of the newcomer. The elder watched the scene with an air of superiority, pleased to see that his invocation was completely defenseless. The mysterious figures remained impassive, their eyes gleaming in the shadows as they judged the worth of the one they had brought to their world. Tears of frustration and helplessness streamed down the soldier's face. He realized there was no escape from this situation. The sadness in his gaze, however, mixed with a deep confusion. His destiny was no longer in his own hands. Suddenly, a dark energy began to emanate from him. His eyes glowed intensely in the darkness, signaling an imminent transformation. When the light stabilized, he was no longer wearing his tactical uniform. The protagonist now stood, clad in black armor, transformed into a living weapon. The soldier found himself reduced to a mere tool, forced into exhausting manual labor, while chains bound him to his cruel fate. Time lost its meaning. 3, 5, 10 years passed as he fulfilled every order of the empire, repeatedly massacring enemies in an endless cycle. The elder continued his narrative with indifference, pausing only to drink as if discussing the weather and not human lives. While the old man drank calmly, the soldier listened in tense silence. The disparity between one's authority and the other's forced servitude was clear. The attention of both turned to the bulletin board on the wall. Several wanted posters were displayed, revealing the targets of imperial ambition. The focus fell on the image of a blonde knight. He had been identified as a threat from the kingdom of Teutonia, marked for death. The mere sight of that target provoked a visceral reaction in the protagonist. The magic collar activated instantly, punishing any sign of agitation or insubordination. The soldier gritted his teeth as the magic suffocated him. The collar was a constant and painful reminder that his will no longer belonged to him. His mind was transported to the past, remembering a city consumed by fire. The chaos of war and the destruction of that day still haunted him. On that occasion, his hands were forced to act. He plunged his sword into the blonde opponent, carrying out the fatal order despite his internal reluctance. The confrontation was tragic. The soldier lamented the situation before his victim, admitting that, under the command of the Empire, he had no choice but to fight. The pain of regret marked his face. There was no pleasure in victory, only the bitter taste and guilt for having taken the life of an equal. The defeated knight, however, smiled with blood on his lips. He stared at his executioner with a look that knew a cruel truth. As he fell dead, the victim left a final warning. The soldier understood that this fate also awaited him. He would be discarded as soon as he ceased to be useful. The premonition hung in the air. The soldier barely had time to process the warning before feeling the approach of another imposing figure behind him. A sudden and brutal blow pierced the young man's throat, catching him completely off guard. Blood spurted out before he could even understand the origin of the fatal attack. Behind him, the older knight smiled mockingly as the city burned. The traitor ironically congratulated the hero from another world for his supposed success, revealing his true face. The protagonist tried to stop the bleeding, but life was quickly ebbing away. The physical pain was excruciating, but the disbelief in the face of that betrayal hurt even more. The executioner, however, showed no mercy. He tightened his grip on the sword, preparing to finish the job with a sadistic pleasure plastered on his face. The young man's vision began to darken and lose focus. Hatred burned in his eyes, even as his strength abandoned him, leaving him unable to react to the cruel fate. A second devastating blow struck his back, sealing his fate. The blade pierced the armor and flesh without resistance, scattering blood violently across the battlefield. As the young man's body collapsed lifelessly, the assassin said goodbye coldly. He pronounced his victim's name, Han Sung, with disdain, ending that alliance with death. Han Sung lay on the cold ground, his gaze fixed and empty. Death claimed him amidst the humiliation and failure of his mission in that strange world. The corpse remained stretched out on the stones, bathed in its own blood and abandoned. However, that tragic and lonely end was only the prelude to a new journey. While one existence faded into darkness, another spark ignited instantly. The cycle of death was broken, and where one life closed its eyes, another opened them. An exhausted but radiant woman looked at the newborn with infinite tenderness. Tears of emotion and relief filled her eyes as she saw her son's face for the first time. She held the child protectively, watched by a long-haired man beside her. The father, however, commented that he had the feeling of having seen that face before. Little Han Sung opened his eyes, feeling the soft touch on his cheek. His expression, however, was not one of innocence, but of confusion and irritation upon awakening again. The dark-haired man narrowed his eyes, deeply analyzing the child. There was a seriousness there that was not fitting for a newborn, arousing his immediate suspicion. Determined to investigate that anomaly, he reached out towards the cradle. A purple magical energy emanated from his fingers, ready to probe the true nature of that new life. Necropolis stood imposingly under the night sky. This was the heart of the Empire, and the birthplace of forbidden magic. It was there that his previous life met a brutal end. The memory of the betrayal and the fatal blow still burned vividly in his mind. However, fate had granted him a new chance. Now he found himself surrounded by the warmth of a new family. The newborn smiled, trying to act with the innocence expected of a baby so as not to arouse suspicion, but inside, fury was seething. He swore that he would annihilate every one of the damned bastards of the empire, especially that traitorous knight. The father, however, noticed the sudden change in the atmosphere. The joy of the moment gave way to a silent doubt. The mother and the maid also noticed the tension. That fixed, intense look didn't seem to belong to an ordinary child. The baby couldn't keep up the disguise for long. His eyes revealed a coldness and awareness far beyond his physical age. The old lady holding him visibly shuddered. She felt an instinctive fear emanating from the small body in her arms. The long-haired patriarch observed the scene with analytical attention, trying to understand the nature of that behavior. He crossed his arms, pondering silently, while the maid tried to maintain her composure before his inquisitive gaze. Suddenly, the pressure became unbearable. The woman recoiled in fright, feeling the raw hostility that the baby radiated, a dark and murderous aura, a reflection of his former warrior self, manifested menacingly behind the child. The baby tried to contain his bloodlust, frustrated. Luckily for him, his parents interpreted that intensity as just a strong-willed inheritance. The danger of being discovered passed. While the parents celebrated their son's strong personality, the protagonist felt exhausted by the tension of the moment. Hansung's mother intervened firmly, raising her hand to protect her son. She made it clear, with her posture, that she would not tolerate any threat against the baby. The tension dissipated as she changed her expression to a gentle smile. Tenderly, she began to pat the child's back lightly, offering the comfort he needed. The rhythmic and gentle touch of her hand brought a physical sense of security. That simple gesture began to calm the newborn's agitated heart. However, the protagonist's mind was suddenly pulled into the past. He vividly recalled the moments of violence and despair from his previous life as a warrior. The memories of physical pain returned with force. He remembered when he stanched his own wounds, fighting to survive amidst the chaos of battle. At that time, loneliness was his only companion. He saw himself isolated and wounded, while others seemed indifferent or even mocked his miserable condition. The contrast between that cold past and the warmth of his new mother's embrace was overwhelming. Feeling welcomed for the first time in a long time, his emotions overflowed. The father, who was watching the scene a little further away, noticed the sudden change in his son's behavior and looked curiously at his wife and the baby. Unable to contain the weight of two lives, Hansung burst into tears. He cried copiously, releasing all the accumulated anguish under the watchful gaze of his new parents. The years passed quickly after that day. One night, in the comfort of their chambers, the couple talked about how time had flown since their son's birth. The mother commented, laughing, about the boy's obsessive dedication to his studies. She believed that his incessant interest in books was a characteristic inherited directly from his father. The major listened to the comment with an amused smile on his face. He responded ironically, recalling a specific promise he had made about the boy's magical training. Adjusting his hair with a carefree air, the father seemed satisfied. He knew that, regardless of his promises, his son's curious nature could not be contained. Indeed, young Hansung spent his days surrounded by piles of books. He studied magic with a concentration and maturity far beyond his physical age. The mother watched him with a radiant look of pride and affection. She saw a bright future in her son, admiring his passion for knowledge. Hansung's father observed the environment with an enigmatic smile on his lips. He seemed to be awaiting the unfolding of a specific situation, demonstrating an unsettling calm. Suddenly, one of the maids interrupted the silence, calling him with urgency and fear. The man slowly turned his face towards the voice, his presence dominating the room. The atmosphere became tense immediately. While the father maintained a stern and analytical expression, Hansung's mother showed clear anxiety, worried about what was about to happen. On the floor, the young protagonist struggled to stay conscious. A bluish and unstable energy emanated from his body, attracting the attention of the parents who had just arrived at the door. The magical power went out of control, spinning violently around the boy like a storm. Hansung, frightened by his own strength that he couldn't contain, desperately called out to his parents. The woman immediately ran to support her son, holding his face with distress. Behind her, however, the father prepared his own magic, ready to intervene in the chaotic situation. With a precise and authoritative movement, the man extended his hand. He manipulated the dispersed energy with ease, demonstrating absolute control over the magic that surrounded little Hansung. The boy, feeling suddenly dominated by his father's strength, panicked. He begged to be released, struggling and fearing severe punishment for the magical accident. An oppressive and dark aura arose behind the Duke. He stared at his son intensely, questioning whether the child had just consciously released mana from his body. Trembling before that imposing figure, the boy stammered, unable to formulate a coherent response. He watched his father's hand approach his face, anticipating the worst. To his utter surprise, the touch was gentle. The father's expression softened into a proud smile as he stroked Hansung's head, approving of his son's feat. The young boy flinched instinctively, closing one eye in anticipation of a blow that never came. Upon realizing the unexpected affection, he became confused and broke out in a cold sweat. The mother, realizing that her husband was not angry, but rather impressed, clasped her hands in delight. Her previous worry instantly transformed into joy and maternal pride. Realizing that he needed to keep up appearances to survive that moment, Hansung forced an innocent smile. He agreed with his mother, hiding his true nervousness under a childish mask. Clutching his book tightly against his chest, the boy hurried away. While his parents talked in the background, Hansung only thought about escaping that suffocating pressure as quickly as possible. Dale's father smiled, showing a calculating satisfaction. It seemed that the plans for the family's future were going exactly as he wished. A short time later, the great hall filled with light and noise. The banquet to celebrate the young master's birthday had begun. Nobles from all over the region attended, eager to pay their respects. One count assured that he would never miss that celebration for anything in the world. Expectation grew among the guests. As they talked, everyone wondered when the protagonist of the party would finally make his triumphant entrance. However, Dale remained isolated in a more secluded corner. The growing noise of the crowd was already beginning to bother his sensitive ears. The boy sighed, feeling the weight of social obligation. The mere prospect of having to celebrate his own birthday exhausted him. Overcome by mental fatigue, the young man crossed his arms and closed his eyes. He decided to enjoy the last moments of peace before facing the public. His mind wandered to recent memories in the library. Even surrounded by books, his father's imposing presence always demanded absolute caution. During his studies, he had focused on a specific record. His fingers traced the image of a familiar warrior, seeking connections to his past life. Dale remembered observing his parents from a distance. He needed to ensure that his secret investigations were not discovered by the adults. Back in the present, something in the hall captured his immediate attention. He spotted a familiar figure entering the room accompanied. It was his mother, dressed elegantly for the occasion. Beside her, however, walked someone hidden under a heavy and mysterious cloak. She warmly congratulated him on his 8th birthday. Dale, however, ignored the greeting, focused entirely on discovering who the person behind her was. The boy kept his guard up while his mother smiled carefree. The presence of the hooded figure was completely out of place in the festive atmosphere. The stranger then made a sudden movement. A hand rose towards the hood, about to reveal the identity hidden in the shadows. The newcomer was introduced as Sifia, a renowned elder of the Blue Magic Tower. In addition to being a master of water magic, she carried the imposing title of Illuminated Demon. His mother announced, beaming, that this would be her son's new tutor. Young Hansung, however, was shocked by the sudden and unilateral decision. Elena leaned in to whisper something to the boy, winking complicitly. She seemed extremely pleased to have arranged a safe alternative for his education. The protagonist immediately understood the maneuver. It became evident that his mother was desperate to prevent him from having any contact with the family's dark magic. Sefia requested a moment alone with the boy. While Elena enthusiastically approved of the interaction, Hansung realized that he had no choice but to accept. The mage took the young man to a secluded and snow-covered area. The sound of the wind filled the silence as she began to explain the situation. As they walked, Sefia mentioned that he should learn something different. Hansung walked beside her, listening to the proposal with an expression of disinterest and resignation. The elf tried to be persuasive, smiling as she discoursed about the training. The boy, however, only felt uncomfortable with that forced imposition. Sefia paused, bringing her finger to her lips in a thoughtful gesture. She seemed to be assessing how much the boy knew about the circumstances of his own birth. That educational arrangement had deep roots. The restricted conditions of the marriage between Duke Noir and Elena were famous throughout the empire. Years ago, Elena feared the Duke's sinister reputation. To win her over, he made a solemn promise to never teach his dark arts to the son they had. The wedding ceremony reflected this pact. Everyone wore pure white, banishing the traditional black robes of the family, symbolizing a future free from dark magic. Back in the present, Sefia watched the boy hidden behind a tree. She analyzed his reaction, aware of the weight that ancient promise exerted on the young man. The mage then came out of the shadows with a new posture. She assured that she would convince his mother, but questioned whether the boy would accept following her personal guidance. Hansung reacted with an expression of doubt and confusion. Faced with that ambiguous offer, the young man needed to process what that tutelage would really mean for his future. The elf laughed softly, finding the situation amusing. She seemed to appreciate the irony of the moment, with an air of playful superiority. She then questioned his logic about the natural order. For her, even the miracles of the priests, who brought the dead back, defied the laws that he believed to be absolute. Hansung immediately noticed the difference. That woman did not share the limited and rigid vision common to the race of elves. With the philosophical point established, the elf decided to move forward. It was time to put the theory aside and begin the real practical lesson. The young man listened attentively, although his expression showed a slight doubt or boredom about what was to come. Following the instructions, Hansung closed his eyes. He placed his hand on his chest, focusing only on the rhythm of his own heart. Suddenly, his eyes opened, shining with an intense blue light. He had accessed something deep within himself, awakening his senses. The mentor explained that such power was the privilege of a few. Only ancestral and supreme beings, such as dragons, possessed this innate ability. For any other being walking under the night, reaching this level of existence required transcending common limitations. The ultimate goal was to form a mana heart. The task required gathering the scattered fragments of energy to create an artificial vital core. Ixamel Hansung began to manipulate the energy around him. The elf watched with a smile, waiting to see the boy's first clumsy attempts. The air around him began to crackle with magical electricity. The young man channeled the power of the environment, drawing the light into the center of his being. To the instructor's absolute surprise, the process was immediate. Hansung stretched out his hands, materializing the result of his concentration. The elf's expression changed drastically, her smile giving way to astonishment. Shock took over her face as she realized what the boy had accomplished. Between Hansung's hands, a perfect sphere of pure mana spun intensely. He had condensed the energy with frightening ease on his first try. The young man manipulated raw energy with frightening ease, suggesting that he was a true prodigy by birth. The mentor watched the scene, unable to hide her shock. It defied everything she knew about teaching magic. Hansung closed his eyes, ignoring the astonishment around him. He needed to refine that chaotic power. Normally, a beginner would struggle just to release mana, but he was already far beyond that basic step. In his mind, he accessed memories of a life of combat. The murderous intent of an experienced warrior awakened. He focused the magic on his fingertips, shaping it with the specific purpose of creating a lethal weapon against the Empire. The shadow of his past overlapped with the present. It wasn't a child conjuring, but a war veteran. The mana responded immediately to his will, solidifying into a sharp and dangerous crystal shard. The elf noticed the change in the nature of the magic. Her curiosity suddenly turned into apprehension. Without warning, Han Sung fired the magical projectile at a nearby tree, testing his creation. The attack hit the target with impressive speed, releasing the accumulated energy on impact. The force of the blow was devastating, pulverizing the wood in a violent explosion. Faced with the destruction caused, the mentor remained motionless, processing the magnitude of that offensive power. She looked at the boy, trying to understand how he possessed such practical combat knowledge. The cold wind blew between them, but the real chill came from the realization that this boy was a dangerous anomaly. Han Sung smiled and waved innocently, trying to disguise the magnitude of the power he had just demonstrated. He hoped his childish behavior would calm the situation. The elf, however, remained on the ground, stunned. Analyzing the traces of magic, she realized that the boy not only created ice, but absorbed the cold from the environment perfectly. That mana manipulation was sublime and terrifying. The technique demonstrated absolute control over the natural elements, something impossible for a beginner. The young man looked away, feigning shyness at her silence. Meanwhile, the mentor stared at him with a flushed face, the cold sweat betraying her nervousness. She turned to leave, casting one last look back. The elf knew that what she had witnessed there would change the way she saw her student. Alone again, Han Sung's expression turned somber. He looked at the artifact in his hands, aware that his display had been too precise for a child. The structure of the spell he cast involved complex rotation of energy. It was a level of technical sophistication that could never be created unconsciously by a child's mind. The process included acceleration and compression of mana, following the golden ratio of military magic. The protagonist had replicated, by instinct, a lethal combat formula. The mentor said goodbye with a forced and trembling smile. She needed to get out of there quickly to report the anomaly she had just discovered. Later, in a private setting, she met with the lord of the house. The elf openly questioned her ability to continue teaching young Dale. The boy's father listened attentively, maintaining a serious expression. The hesitation in the teacher's voice made it clear that the matter was of extreme gravity. He remained silent for a moment, pondering the information. The lord realized that his son's talent brought worrying implications. The elf explained that the magic used followed perfect military patterns. It wasn't just raw power, but the application of a science made for war. Her conclusion was direct and chilling. Young Master Dale not only had a talent for magic, he possessed a natural instinct to kill. The Lord brought his hand to his face, absorbing the weight of those words. The revelation about the lethal nature of his heir required deep reflection. The mentor took a sip of tea, remaining calm. She knew that the situation required delicacy, but also firmness in her analysis of the child's future. She expressed an unwavering desire to guide the boy personally. For her, it was imperative to shape that raw talent with her own hands before it became uncontrollable. Han Sung's father listened to the proposal, feeling cornered. Faced with the arguments presented, he realized that refusing the elf's offer was not a viable option. Anxiety showed on his face. The confirmation that his son possessed such a dangerous nature and murderous instincts left him visibly shaken. Silence hung over the table as the decision was sealed. The mentor maintained a cordial smile, aware that she had managed to convince the Lord. However, her expression soon turned serious and apprehensive. The responsibility of training someone with that frightening potential would not be a simple task. Meanwhile, Han Sung waited alone in the hallway. The boy looked exhausted on board, leaning against the wall as time passed slowly. The elf, for a moment, showed genuine concern. The gravity of what she was about to undertake weighed on her. Han Sung hid his face in his arms, trembling slightly. He made the internal decision to suppress and control his power from now on to avoid further suspicion. Suddenly, a shadow fell on the rug. The boy noticed a new presence in the room and raised his head, alert. In an instant, any trace of concern disappeared. Hansung forced a bright, innocent smile, changing his attitude to greet whoever it was. A robust man in full armor entered the room. He seemed to have just arrived from a mission, but displayed a friendly and relaxed smile. The knight looked down, delighted with the child. Hansung maintained his role perfectly, acting like a happy boy in front of the warrior. The man grabbed the boy with sudden affection. Hansung was lifted off the ground in a vigorous hug. Surprised by the newcomer's warm reception, the warrior lifted him high, laughing enthusiastically. He spoke loudly about adventures and defeating terrible monsters, treating the little assassin like a normal child. The knight lifted little Hansung into the air with ease. The protagonist maintained his innocent smile, perfectly playing the role of a happy child in front of the visitor. However, the young man's gaze darkened for a moment. He coldly analyzed the situation, assessing the man's intentions while maintaining his facade. The warrior began to recount the dangers plaguing the kingdom. Cruel monsters invaded civilian areas, causing massive destruction and suffering to the population. To contain this threat, the knights of each domain dedicated their lives to clearing dungeons and eliminating the beasts that escaped to the surface. The situation in the Duchy of Saxony, however, was critical. The threat there was much more severe and constant than in any other neighboring territory. Hansung listened to the explanation with poorly disguised disinterest. For someone with his previous life experience, this basic lesson was tedious and irrelevant. The man finally put the boy on the ground. Kneeling down to be at the child's height, he continued his justification with a serious and respectful tone. As they talked, both of their attention was diverted. An imposing presence appeared at the door, silently observing the interaction between the warrior and the boy. The lord of the house watched everything with satisfaction. With his arms crossed, Hansung's father displayed a confident smile, aware of his son's hidden potential. Soon after, the lady of the house also made her entrance. Accompanied by her maids, she hurried down the hallway upon seeing the small group. The woman's expression lit up immediately. Genuine joy shone on her face as she reunited with her son in that formal setting. Ignoring any protocol, she bent down to wrap Hansung in a warm embrace, while the father and the knight watched the familiar scene. The lord maintained his discreet smile as he watched the interaction. There was an air of approval on his face as he watched over his family. The mother held the boy's face gently. She examined him with eyes full of adoration, delighted with her son's presence. Unable to contain herself, she pinched his cheek affectionately. Hansung, trapped in that childish body, simply endured the gesture with silent resignation. The innocent and sudden request from little Hansung left his parents completely bewildered. The couple exchanged flushed glances, unsure how to react to such a direct family demand. The situation was too much for the captain, who had to fight to avoid laughing at his lord's embarrassment. The soldier next to him tried to maintain his posture, but his superior's amusement was evident. Night fell over the city, bringing silence, but the comedic tension persisted for a moment. Hansung's father reprimanded the subordinate, demanding seriousness, although the moment of levity had already passed. Years later, Hansung, now a young man, rested in his chambers. However, his mind found no rest, wandering through thoughts that troubled him deeply as he stared at the ceiling. Suddenly, the tranquility disappeared. His eyes opened with a supernatural intensity, shining with an accumulated energy and an alarming focus. A brutal memory invaded his mind, as if it were real. He saw himself again, at the mercy of a known enemy, hearing mocking words about the time that had passed since their last encounter. There was no chance of defense in that vivid nightmare. The young man felt the overwhelming force of the traitor tightening his neck, dominating him with terrifying and humiliating ease. Blood sputtered as life seemed to drain away. The enemy laughed cruelly, mocking the domestic happiness and family love that Hansung had achieved, turning everything into mockery. That face, distorted by malice and illuminated by a sinister light, filled his vision. The expression of pure sadistic pleasure on the murderer's face was the last thing he wanted to see. Han Sung woke up with a violent start, his body reacting to the terror of the memory. Magical energy crackled uncontrollably around him, exploding outward due to the intense emotional shock. The phantom pain of death still echoed in his chest. He gasped, struggling to breathe and bringing his hand to his heart as he tried to contain the unstable power that leaked from his control. Gradually, the energy dissipated into the silent room. He remained sitting on the bed, alone in the darkness, trying to distinguish reality from the ghosts of his traumatic past. Still dizzy and staggering, he got up and walked around the room. Hatred burned within him, and he cursed the empire responsible for all that suffering and for the scars he carried. The coldness of the night outside seemed to reflect the ice in his own heart. The residual energy still danced in the air, a witness to the internal turmoil that the young man was trying to suppress. He squeezed his chest tightly, feeling his heart beat erratically against his ribs. The physical anguish served as a constant reminder that the past had not yet been overcome. Chord et XML Hansung struggled to contain the power surging within him. Behind him, the mysterious figure noticed his distress, commenting on the delicate situation the boy was in. The elven woman observed the chaotic energy around the child. She realized she needed to act fast before that force became too unstable. The young man clutched his chest, suffocated by the uncontrolled flow of mana. However, a sudden touch interrupted his panic, seeking to stabilize the energy. She understood the gravity of the moment. If the malice in his heart consumed his magic at that instant, the damage to the boy's soul would be irreversible. Under her influence, the violent energy began to condense. Hansung stared at his own hands, surprised to see the raw power take on a controlled form. The pain subsided, leaving the boy stunned. He looked up, trying to understand how that dangerous outburst had been contained so easily. The woman stared at him with a serious and assessing expression. She had made an important decision about the future of that powerful child. From her robes, she withdrew a thick blue-covered book, adorned with a shining jewel that seemed to contain magic of its own. It was an ancient grimoire marked with a mystical symbol. The object emanated a presence that demanded respect and caution. She handed the artifact to Han Sung. Recognizing its danger and potential, she declared that she would be the ideal person to teach him how to control such power. The boy held the heavy book with both hands. A dark energy pulsed from the object, reacting immediately to his touch. The woman's serious demeanor disappeared, replaced by a radiant and gentle smile. She seemed genuinely pleased with how things were unfolding. Han Sung was caught off guard by the sudden change in mood. Before he could react, she began to congratulate him on that special day. She pulled him into a warm embrace. It was a birthday present sealing the beginning of the relationship between master and apprentice. Days later, the pair walked through the icy landscape around the North Tower. The mentor began her lessons, instructing the young man to recall the hunts he had done with his father. A small rabbit hopped through the snow, oblivious to the impending danger. The creature served as the perfect target for the practical test that was about to begin. Han Sung focused his energy, manifesting a magic circle in the palm of his hand. Under the watchful eye of his mentor, he prepared to release the spell. The animal hesitated for a moment, as if sensing the fluctuation of mana in the air. The tension of the moment froze the prey in place. Without hesitation, the young man fired. Magic flowed from his fingers, converting his will into a direct and swift attack. A bolt of blue energy descended from the heavens, striking the target with overwhelming force. The impact was instantaneous and brutal. The resulting explosion raised a cloud of snow and debris, engulfing both mages. The power released exceeded expectations for a simple exercise. The elf observed the scene with an analytical gaze. She assessed not only the accuracy of the attack, but the amount of raw power the boy had employed. She walked towards the site of the impact. It was necessary to closely inspect the consequences of that release of energy. Before the mangled carcass, the magnitude of the damage became evident. The young man realized that his control still needed to be refined to avoid such unnecessary destruction. However, the mentor smiled openly, finding the situation amusing. The boy's excessive strength seemed to amuse her more than worry her. Han Sung turned his attention to her, seeking guidance. He needed to understand where he had gone wrong, or if this was the expected result. The woman then explained the fundamental principle of magic. While demonstrating her own power, she taught that mana only materialized what existed in the mage's heart. The young man listened with an expression of perplexity and focus. The lesson about the connection between emotion and magic resonated deeply within him. Satisfied with the day's lesson, the elf maintained a gentle smile. Han Sung, however, remained serious, processing the weight of that new knowledge. Meanwhile, in a distant location consumed by flames, a mysterious man manipulated the fire. The smile on his face suggested that the destruction was only the beginning. The imposing magic tower stood as a monument to arcane knowledge, guarding secrets that defined the very essence of magic in that world. Magic flowed there not only as raw power, but as a refined art gently shaped by the hands of those who understood its deep nature. The elven mentor explained with the authority of one who masters the subject that the central philosophy of each tower served as the immutable foundation for its entire magical system. She concluded the theoretical explanation with a serene and encouraging smile, waiting for her pupil to absorb the gravity of those words before proceeding. Han Sung, however, seemed momentarily confused, trying to process how those abstract concepts would apply to the practical reality of combat. Leaving the theory aside, the young man went into action. He reached out his hand, channeling a dark and sinister energy towards a small animal in the snow. The black magic swirled violently around the hair, enveloping it in a dense aura that foreshadowed an unnatural and dangerous transformation. From within that dark energy, a spectral and menacing entity began to manifest, responding directly to the necromancer's call. The elf watched attentively as Han Sung maintained his focus on the flow of mana, ensuring that the reanimation spell was executed with precision. The ritual was a success. The creature, now an undead under the boy's command, displayed bright red eyes, pulsing with the energy of darkness. Away! Following the instructions to strengthen his creation, Han Sung activated a new magic circle, his eyes shining intensely as he invoked the element of ice. A column of cold, crystalline light descended from the heavens, striking the target forcefully to fuse elemental magic to the necromantic structure. The result was an armored beast. The small being was now covered by impenetrable ice armor and lethal spikes, ready for combat. The mentor, determined to verify the quality of the work, conjured her own magic projectiles, announcing that she would test the resistance of that defense immediately. Han Sung widened his eyes, suddenly tense and apprehensive as he realized that the practical test would be much more intense than he had imagined. The ray of magical energy descended relentlessly, colliding violently against the target. The force of the impact illuminated the dark forest, testing the limits of the defense that had been erected. The ice creature shuddered under the crushing pressure. Fragments of its frozen shell flew through the air as the structure struggled to remain intact in the face of the destructive power. Han Sung watched the result with a relieved and nervous smile. The young man put his hand to his chest, feeling his heart racing from the tension of the successful test. The elf passed by him with an air of silent approval. The protagonist clenched his fist discreetly, internally vibrating with the small victory he had just achieved. However, the mentor stopped and turned to him suddenly. With a penetrating and curious look, she questioned what the true desire was that moved the boy to seek so much power. The young man regained his composure immediately. Han Sung touched the brooch on his collar, demonstrating that his determination and his motives were clear to himself. However, the elf's next reaction caught him completely off guard. The boy widened his eyes, confused and surprised by the sudden change in the tone of the conversation. The woman shook her finger in warning, blinking enigmatically. She seemed ready to teach a fundamental lesson about the limitations that most mages faced. Elsewhere, Scholars dedicated entire lives to the theoretical understanding of magic. Common knowledge dictated that the arcane path was full of rigid and immutable rules. For the vast majority of apprentices, mastering a single element was already an arduous task. The young noble struggled to control his flames under the critical and severe gaze of his instructor. Manipulating opposing forces simultaneously was a feat considered almost impossible. Only legends or rare prodigies managed to balance conflicting energies like fire and ice. The elf smiled, aware that her student did not fit the common rules. She saw in him a potential that transcended the limitations imposed on other mages. Upon perceiving the implicit recognition, Han Sung did not contain his excitement. A wide and confident smile lit up his face at the prospect of his own growth. However, the conversation took a more serious turn about the nature of his ambition. The image of the boy using his powers suggested that his future goals might be much greater than they appeared. Despite this, the young man felt the weight of the other's doubt fall upon him. Han Sung lowered his shoulders, frustrated and discouraged, feeling that all his efforts still didn't seem enough in her eyes. The elf mentor watched the scene, unable to hide her surprise and concern at what she was witnessing. Meanwhile, Han Sung had buried himself in his studies. He walked through the library, carrying a stack of books, almost bigger than himself. The young man placed the heavy load on the ground. Despite the evident exhaustion on his face, his determination to absorb that knowledge remained unwavering. However, his body reached its physical limit. Exhaustion finally took its toll, and he collapsed backward, suddenly losing strength. His consciousness plunged into deep darkness. Only a distant voice echoed through the void, insistently calling him to bring him back. Slowly, his senses returned. Han Sung blinked, struggling to focus his vision and dispel the fog of sleep as he awoke. Later, already in the snowy forest, the mentor walked beside him. She immediately noticed the boy's exhausted state and questioned his evident lack of rest. Concern was etched on her face. Seeing her student exert himself to the point of neglecting his own sleep generated a visible anguish in the elf. Han Sung, however, only smiled to dispel the tension. He extended his hand confidently, eager to demonstrate the practical result of his nocturnal effort. The mana responded promptly to his call. A complex and brilliant magic circle materialized instantly, floating over the palm of his hand. Before them, a huge ice creature took shape. The magical construct rose imposingly among the trees, dominating the landscape with its presence. The young man maintained control of the spell with ease. Upon seeing the success of the conjuration and the student's skill, the mentor's expression softened into a smile of approval. Suddenly, the ice structure reacted aggressively. The contained energy became unstable, causing the creature's surface to begin to shatter violently. The construct detonated with tremendous force. An explosion of ice and magic swept the area, releasing a devastating shockwave in all directions. The elf recoiled, bringing her hand to her chest, completely stunned. The unexpected potency and volatility of that magic left her speechless and visibly shaken. The little creature let out a sharp squeal, releasing a sinister aura. A dark and unstable energy began to accumulate rapidly inside the animal. The power reached its limit and detonated in a flash of blinding light. The resulting explosion shattered the environment, scattering shards of ice violently everywhere. The elf mentor was caught off guard by the sudden intensity of the impact. Examel sharp fragments flew like projectiles, colliding against the magical barrier she raised on instinct. Protected by the hexagonal shield, she looked ahead, stunned by what her student had just done. Han Sung watched the remaining energy sphere in his hand, looking pleased with the experiment. The boy then displayed simultaneous control of two opposing energies, questioning whether that qualified him as a dual mage. The surrounding landscape was devastated. The snow had been swept away, and the earth overturned by the force of the detonation. The elf, however, felt a chill. The tactical implication of that attack was terrifying. By combining the corpse explosion with the ice armor, He had turned the fragments into a long-range shrapnel grenade. She bent down to examine the remains on the ground. Each piece of ice and bone had become a deadly blade. That magic was designed purely to kill, with the efficiency of a war veteran. She wondered how a child could have such a mentality. As Hansung walked carefree, the mentor followed him in silence, disturbed by the lethal nature of her student. A familiar voice echoed through the white vastness, drawing the group's attention in the snow. Someone was waving vigorously at the young master and Lady Sifia. Soon the source of the call revealed itself. A unit of knights was approaching rapidly, riding with military discipline through the icy landscape. It was the dreaded black cavalry of the Duchy of Saxon. They were elite warriors, whose spears emanated an aura of power that commanded immediate respect. At the head of the battalion was Sir Helmut, the captain of the cavalry. His reputation as one of the 7 swordmasters of the continent preceded him. Hansung reacted to the imposing arrival with a radiant smile and applause, showing an almost childlike joy at the sight of the warriors. The brief encounter ended cordially. Lady Sefia and the little protagonist waved goodbye as the knights prepared to go their way. Before leaving, the captain wished them both a safe return, showing respect for the elf and her pupil. With the departure of the cavalry, the mentor turned to the boy. She decided it was time to end the outdoor training and return to the castle. The young master obeyed promptly, walking behind Lady Sefia as they left the snowy forest behind. Later, already in the comfort of the residence's interior, tea was served, marking the transition to a conversation of extreme importance. While holding her cup, the elf couldn't help but think about the contrast between the innocent child and the overwhelming magical power he had demonstrated. She kept her hands steady on the table, carefully choosing how she would address the delicate matter she needed to discuss. On the other side, the boy's parents listened attentively. The couple, holding hands, showed a mixture of anxiety and seriousness in the face of the account. Lady Sefia felt the weight of the revelation she was about to make, aware that it would change their perception of their son. The sunlight bathed the interior of the room through the curtains, bringing an apparent calm to the decisive conversation that was taking place. The Duchess, full of hope and pride, formally requested that the water magic instruction for her son continue. The elf readily accepted the responsibility, solemnly committing to take care of the boy's development from then on. However, the mentor turned to the Duke with a sincere apology for breaking a promise she had previously made to him. The mother, however, could hardly contain her enthusiasm. She extolled the extraordinary fact that her son had become a jewel mage at only 8 years old. The Duc de Noir, on the other hand, seemed stunned. The revelation about the precocious talent and the nature of his son's power left him visibly shaken. The weight of the news was such that the man needed a moment to compose himself, under the worried gaze of his wife. The mentor explained her motivations. She wished to give the young lord the strength necessary to bear his future obligations. Furthermore, she admitted that, as a mage, she could not ignore the unique opportunity to guide such an exceptionally talented disciple. Hansung's father remained silent, hiding his face in his hands as he processed the heavy implications of that destiny. Upon looking up, the tension on his face was evident, but he seemed to seek acceptance. The Duchess waited anxiously for his reaction. The final goal was established: to train him to be a necromancer, powerful enough to ignore the stigma and prejudice of the world. Perceiving the gravity of the decision and her husband's internal conflict, the wife approached to comfort him with a gesture of affection. The Duke finally yielded, embracing Elena with a resigned smile. He understood and accepted the difficult path that the family would need to tread. Hansung watched the interaction in silence, surprised to witness the depth of emotions and the concern that his parents nurtured for him. The Duke massaged his temples, showing clear signs of exhaustion. The responsibility of teaching the dark arts to his own son weighed heavily on him. They descended to the magic atelier. The location, hidden in the foundations of the castle, served as a private sanctuary for the Noir family's experiments. The father began the lesson sternly. He emphasized the complexity of necromancy, warning that even the most basic spells required absolute respect and precision. The theory presented was overwhelming. Faced with piles of ancient tomes, the Duke questioned whether the boy truly understood the magnitude of the required study. Han-sung, however, dove into his studies with fervor. Surrounded by the books his father had given him, he absorbed all the basic knowledge required, finishing exhausted but satisfied. The Duke recognized his son's effort. Realizing that the fundamentals had been mastered, he handed over the final grimoire, authorizing the next step. A smile of approval appeared on the father's face. Han-sung's dedication allowed them to advance faster than expected to the next phase. The boy's attention was suddenly captured. The theoretical study environment had changed, giving way to a more sinister, practical preparation. On the stone table lay a corpse. Han-sung immediately identified the creature as a goblin, realizing that the training would no longer be just hypothetical. The Duke awaited his son's reaction. He watched attentively, curious to see if the presence of a real monster would shake the young man's determination. Han-sung did not hesitate. He positioned himself in the center of the magic circle, facing his father seriously, ready to demonstrate his ability. The practical test began. When the Duke inquired about the method of control, the boy extended his hand, invoking mana to respond with action. Han-sung's concentration was total. He focused all his will on manipulating the energy, ignoring the cold sweat that the mental effort provoked. The corpse reacted immediately to the spell. The goblin's body was violently pulled upwards, moving unnaturally under the command of the magic. The Duke observed the success of the ritual. Han-sung controlled the dead creature with threads of purple mana, proving that he had mastered the art of necromancy. Han-sung concentrated intensely, manipulating the mana threads with precision. Behind him, the Duke watched every movement, assessing his son's control over the forbidden magic. However, the practical lesson reached its limit. The father placed his hand firmly on the boy's shoulder, silently signaling that it was time to stop. The interruption was sudden. Han-sung turned, surprised, as the energy around the summoned creature began to react to the Duke's dominating presence. The magical bond was broken instantly. Before the young man's astonished gaze, the force that animated the corpse dissipated, causing the inert body to collapse into the void. But the Duke didn't just cancel the spell. He obliterated it. Blades of pure energy tore through the air, undoing the structure of the residual magic with violence. The goblin's corpse was consumed by a vortex of power. Han-sung watched helplessly as the creation he had worked so hard to raise was effortlessly dismantled. The destruction was total. The necrotic energy imploded on the target, ensuring that nothing remained of the temporary abomination beyond dust and shadows. The leader of the Noir house observed the result coldly. His power was absolute, and he did not hesitate to demonstrate the true nature of that dark art. Han-sung felt a chill run down his spine. The ease with which his father manipulated such terrible forces left him visibly shaken and intimidated. With the monster reduced to nothing, the man turned to his son. He seemed satisfied not only with the test, but with the opportunity to teach through fear and respect. The atmosphere became heavy again. Han-sung remained silent, understanding that his training was just beginning, and that the path ahead would be arduous. The Duke then summoned an energy sphere, mentioning the Noir magic tower. He began to explain the origin and magnitude of the power that now ran in the boy's veins. An enigmatic smile curved the father's lips. He realized that the young man had the capacity to bear the weight of that dark legacy. The man continued his theoretical explanation, gesturing as magic flowed around him. Han-sung absorbed each teaching, aware of the vital importance of those words. The Duke held his son firmly, his intense gaze demanding absolute attention. He needed Han-sung to understand the gravity of what was being said at that crucial moment. The young man felt the weight of that hand on his shoulder like an anchor. His father's seriousness made him freeze, realizing that the lesson went far beyond simple magical theory. Suddenly, the atmosphere seemed to change drastically in the boy's mind. The image of a relentless warrior emerged, bathed in the flames of a chaotic battlefield. That night imposed his dominating presence on the defeated. Faced with his overwhelming power, only the submission of those who had already lost all hope remained. The reflection on the sharp blade announced the final verdict. The cold metal shone intensely, promising imminent violence against those who were at his mercy. Without any hesitation, the executioner raised his heavy weapon against the prisoner. The rigid posture indicated that mercy was not an option in that war scenario. The blow came down mercilessly, ignoring the victim's desperate pleas. The blade pierced flesh and bone, silencing the plea for clemency in a brutal instant. Back in reality, Han Song's heart skipped a beat. The shock of that sudden vision, or perhaps the oppressive aura of his own father, left him stunned. Terror showed in his wide eyes. The young man struggled to control his breathing, feeling the cold sweat trickle down as he tried to process the overwhelming fear he felt. Even haunted by the bloody image, Han Song forced himself to respond. He lied about his condition, assuring his father that he was fine while trying to hide the tremor in his voice. Duke Sion watched the situation with a cold, calculating gaze, keeping his suspicions alive. As time passed, the young boy grew up under the shadow of that imposing figure, aware that he was constantly being evaluated. The image of a perfect and happy family, however, was nothing more than a fragile illusion about to shatter. Behind the scenes, malicious figures and conspirators closely watched every move of the ducal house. The malice in the gazes of these hidden threats made it clear that the boy's safety was at risk, and all this hostile attention and expectation fell solely on the shoulders of the young heir. The world around him seemed to close in, isolating him amidst secrets and shadows that suffocated him. However, the protagonist did not falter. His eyes showed an iron determination at the moment of impact. Weeks later, in the duchy's training grounds, the young boy faced physical challenges far beyond his age. The instructor showed no mercy, delivering quick blows that tested the boy's reflexes to the limit. Although his body was small and his breathing heavy, he stood firm before that colossal opponent. The wooden sword cut through the air violently, a sudden attack that allowed no hesitation. The instructor charged with full force, forcing the young boy to react purely on survival instinct. The impact was devastating, causing the child's body to tremble and recoil under the crushing pressure of the blow. Brute force prevailed at that moment, throwing the boy violently against the dusty ground. The knight widened his eyes, completely taken by surprise by the sudden movement he had just witnessed. In an instant, the boy managed to unbalance the adult, sending the wooden sword flying away and embedding it forcefully in the snow. The man raised his hands in immediate surrender, laughing loudly at his own defeat, while the boy tried to catch his breath. The young boy, however, didn't seem to find the situation funny. He wiped his face with an expression of obvious annoyance. He protested vehemently, arguing about the danger of the combat. He knew that if those techniques were real, the result would have been fatal for any ordinary person. The boy looked at his own hands, observing the marks, calluses, and wounds resulting from his exhaustive effort. Noticing the child's silence and withdrawn posture, the man reached out to him, concerned. With a gentle smile, he tried to console the little one, insisting that there really was no need for him to train so rigorously. Kneeling in the snow, he held the boy's hand, trying to convey comfort and curb that self-destructive routine. The knight observed the bandages covering the small hand, silently acknowledging the pain and sacrifice behind that dedication. But the boy pulled his hand back with energy. A confident smile appeared on his face, showing that his determination remained unwavering. Faced with that audacious and lively response, the man felt pride swell in his chest. He put his hand to his forehead and laughed again, genuinely amazed at the willpower the child demonstrated. The interaction was interrupted by the arrival of an elegant woman, who commented softly on the apparent good mood of the two. Upon hearing her voice, the boy's expression lit up instantly, and he turned to greet her with enthusiasm. The wooden sword remained leaning against the training dummy, marking a silent pause in the physical exertion. Suddenly, the blonde woman appeared with a radiant smile, surprising the young boy with an unexpected gift. However, his mind traveled to the past, remembering a moment when the couple seemed surprised and moved. In that distant memory, the mother displayed a warm and encouraging expression. The boy, still a small child at the time, looked at her with pure expectation and curiosity. The family was gathered in the room, where the mother introduced the newborn to the older brother for the first time. With extreme delicacy and hesitation, he reached out his finger to touch the soft cheek of the sleeping baby. The boy was fascinated, watching in wonder at the fragility of that new life before his eyes. The father, with his imposing posture, watched the interaction with pride, while the mother smiled sweetly. She then encouraged her older son to put aside his shyness and hold his brother in his arms. The boy obeyed and received the small package, though his body was stiff with tension and excessive care. To his mother's surprise, the baby, who usually cried with others, remained calm and happy in his brother's arms. Noticing the little one's acceptance, the boy's nervousness melted away, replaced by a genuine smile of affection. He looked at the baby's face, surprised by the immediate and silent connection that formed between them. The father watched the scene from afar, pleased with the lightness and harmony of that family moment. The baby's innocent laughter filled the air. In that instant, the bond between the brothers strengthened, sealed by the purity of the shared moment. The father watched the scene serenely. A satisfied smile curved his lips as he witnessed the harmony between his children. However, the interaction needed to be interrupted. The man placed his hand on his eldest son's shoulder, drawing his attention back to the reality of his responsibilities. While the mother watched in the background, the father took the opportunity to impart an important lesson. The memory of that day would remain etched in the protagonist's mind. Back in the present, reality was icy. The elven instructor announced with a smile that theory was over. The day's lesson would be a real fight. The young man hesitated, visibly tense. His master's relaxed posture contrasted with his nervousness in the face of the challenge in the snow. There was no room to back down. The boy activated his magic circuits, urgently concentrating mana to prepare for the imminent confrontation. The elf's response was overwhelming. The scenery transformed as she unleashed her magic, forcing the boy to react from a distance. She seemed to be enjoying the test. With graceful and lethal movements, the master conjured shards of ice, launching them mercilessly. The attack cut through the air violently. The frozen blades advanced at high speed, demanding perfect reflexes from the student to avoid being hit. The instructor noticed his holding back. Holding a fragment of ice, she provoked him, questioning whether he really planned to hold back against her. The warning worked. The shock of the provocation made the protagonist understand that this training allowed no hesitation or mercy. A devastating blow descended upon him. The shadow of the attack covered his vision, and momentary fear gave way to the instinct for survival. The impact was tremendous. The force of the magic exploded around him, shaking the ground and testing the limits of the boy's defense. He decided to fight back. Coating his own arm with ice armor, the young man advanced with determination, ready to face the master as an equal. The instructor watched the student with an amused smile. She seemed to find humor in the combat stance he was taking, underestimating what was to come. The boy, however, ignored the silent mockery. Concentrating all his mana, he prepared to execute the move he had been planning, ignoring the fatigue. An immense shadow covered the training field. The heavy impact of a magical structure shook the ground at the elf's feet, announcing the attack. With a commanding shout, the young man summoned his defense. A wall of ice rose instantly, surprising the instructor with the speed of the conjuration. She stared at the translucent barrier that now separated them. The structure was solid and imposing, far beyond what one would expect from a beginner in that art. Curious, the elf reached out to touch the cold surface. She needed to test the density of that magic to understand the boy's true strength. However, as soon as her fingers made contact, cracks began to spread. She sensed a dangerous instability vibrating within the ice. Her expression changed from curiosity to immediate alert. This was not a flaw in the conjuration. It was an intentional trap about to be activated. The protagonist maintained absolute focus. his eyes shining with intensity. He knew exactly the right moment to release the accumulated energy. A blinding light emanated from inside the wall. The magical pressure reached the critical point, transforming the static defense into a time bomb. The instructor widened her eyes, caught completely off guard. She understood his strategy, too late to retreat safely. The ice exploded in all directions. The barrier detonated with full force, releasing a devastating shockwave and shards against her. The young man slid through the snow, protecting himself from the displacement of air. He celebrated internally, seeing that his risky plan had worked perfectly. He had condensed the molecules of the wall to the extreme before the explosion. Instead of just blocking, the super-compressed structure acted like a fragmentation grenade. As the smoke and snow subsided, the boy watched the silhouette in the mist. He waited tensely to see if the surprise attack had been enough. The young man widened his eyes in panic as the smoke cleared. He shouted his master's name, fearing that his explosive trap had caused real and irreparable damage to the instructor. To his shock, her voice came calmly from right behind him. The elf appeared unharmed in the snow, asking in a casual tone if he was looking for her. The boy realized, stunned, that she had moved faster than his eyes could follow. His entire offensive strategy had been avoided without apparent effort. With a simple and elegant gesture, Sephia dissipated the residual magic burning on her glove. She displayed absolute control, extinguishing the blue flames as if they were mere candles. However, the elf touched her own face and smiled. She admitted to being impressed, as she never imagined that a novice mage of the first circle could even scratch her. The protagonist remained still, processing the information. He expected a reprimand or a counterattack, not praise coming from that chaotic situation. Sephia crouched down in the snow, getting to her student's eye level. The combat stance disappeared, replaced by an expression of genuine satisfaction. She pointed to the small cut on his cheek, confessing that this wound filled her with more pride than words could express. The boy could hardly believe the validation he was receiving. With a loving smile, the instructor caressed the young man's head. That gesture confirmed that he had not only passed the test, but exceeded all expectations. Sephia's gaze softened completely. In that moment, she saw in him a potential that she rarely found, feeling grateful to be his mentor. However, the elf's memory transported her to an earlier moment, far from the snow. Her expression turned serious as she recalled the report she had to make. She was in the Duke's office in a formal meeting. In front of the imposing desk, Sephia reported the boy's progress to his father, who listened in silence. The Duke, in turn, seemed tense and worried. The news about his son's exceptional and perhaps dangerous talent made him visibly uncomfortable. The elf, noticing the hesitation, reaffirmed that training such a talented student was a joy for her. Taking the opportunity, she decided to make an additional request to the noble. With a polite and respectful smile, Sephia received permission to proceed. She was about to ask for something important for the young master's future. The Duke assessed the threat on the territory's borders. According to his analysis, the monster invasion was irrelevant, something a simple cavalry squadron would resolve without difficulty. However, the Lord's next decision shocked everyone in the room. He announced coldly his intention to send young Dale directly to that battlefield. Sephia couldn't hide her astonishment. The idea of putting a child on the front lines seemed absurd, and she tried to argue against the sudden order. The boy's father, however, remained impassive. His stern expression made it clear that there was no room for discussion or sentimentality in that decision. He stood up, emanating an oppressive aura that filled the office. The atmosphere weighed down, reinforcing that his authority as leader of the house was absolute. For the Duke, the noble lineage was not a shield, but a burden. He insisted that as heir, the boy needed to understand the weight of his responsibility from an early age. The elven instructor fell silent, although her concern was visible. She feared for her student's safety in the face of such a rigorous and premature test. A slight smile appeared on the Lord's face, suggesting that there was a greater purpose. This test was not just about combat, but about forced maturation. The ultimate goal was revealed. The boy needed to learn to control his own power. The Duke ended the conversation, determined to force his son's evolution. It was a dangerous and forbidden power. The use of that ability required a terrible sacrifice, consuming the user's mana or, ultimately, their own life. In an earlier moment, the Duke guided his son and the instructor through the mansion's corridors. He explained that mastering such arts was a tradition that spanned generations. The Lord spoke with the solemnity of someone passing on an ancient secret. It was necessary for the young man to understand the gravity of the legacy he carried in his blood. Dale listened to everything attentively, surprised by the revelations. The boy was beginning to realize that the world around him was much more complex and dangerous than he imagined. Sophia walked beside them, watching the boy with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The father, in turn, seemed pleased with the curiosity shown by the heir. The place held ancient and dangerous relics, each emanating a sinister, magical aura from within their protective display cases. Duke Cyan guided the boy through the hall, solemnly revealing that these were the Demon King's artifacts in the family's custody. The young man walked down the hall, curiously observing the forbidden objects that had rested there for generations. The Duke noticed the boy's interest and gave a satisfied smile, while the instructor watched the scene silently in the background. However, the adult's expectations soon turned to doubt when the boy stopped, seeming uncertain about what to do next. Suddenly, the Duke's expression changed to pure astonishment as he noticed a dark presence manifesting right behind the protagonist. Ignoring the sudden tension in the air, the young man continued his exploration, passing indifferently by legendary shields and armaments on display. His eyes momentarily fixed on an ornate shield, feeling the pressure and the cool emanating from the magical object. The voices of the artifacts invaded his mind, desperately clamoring to be chosen, and promising unimaginable power and glory. The boy, however, remained unwavering. He glimpsed the tragic fate and death that awaited those who succumbed to those empty temptations. With a confident smile, he rejected the seductive appeals of the relics, demonstrating a determination and arrogance that went beyond his age. His attention turned to the hooded figure floating in the center of the hall, the true source of power that interested him. Upon facing the dark entity up close, the protagonist understood the true nature of what was before him. This was the manifestation of a legendary ability, capable of shaping the shadows themselves and making its user an almost invincible opponent in combat. Without hesitation, the young man accepted the dark cloak, feeling the power envelop his shoulders as he smiled, satisfied with his choice. Emitima itso ekome. Duke Cyan reacted with visible exasperation to the boy's choice. Sophia also seemed apprehensive as she watched this risky decision unfold. Suddenly, a torrent of dark energy exploded from the young man's body. The brute force caught him by surprise, manifesting violently and immediately. The protagonist's consciousness was dragged into a deep void. In that immensity, he perceived the voracious desire of the entity, which desperately cried out for sustenance. The supernatural presence assessed its new host. To that ancient force, physical reality seemed trivial, coldly judging the situation. Visions of an ancestral power invaded the boy's mind. He understood that this magic allowed him to manipulate the shadows, as if they were a living, obedient organism. The young man accepted the bond, holding the artifact firmly. A confident smile appeared on his face as he took control of that energy. The shadows responded immediately to his command, rising behind him as an extension of his own will. The pact was sealed. Upon witnessing the magnitude of that aura, shock paralyzed the observers. The pressure in the environment suddenly became suffocating. A gigantic sphere of condensed energy expanded throughout the hall. The power was so dense that it seemed to distort the very space around them. Duke Cyan put his hand to his head, clearly stunned by the destructive potential that had just been unleashed. Sophia trembled, unable to look away. The magical gale intensified, forcing the adults to retreat. They needed to physically protect themselves against the storm emanating from the small body. Sephia and the Duke struggled to maintain their footing in the face of the gale. The strength of that awakening was far greater than either of them had anticipated. As quickly as it began, the chaos ceased. The energy dissipated, revealing the protagonist intact and enveloped in his new cloak. The boy smiled, showing that he was perfectly fine. He had not only survived the process, but had completely tamed the relic. A heavy silence fell over the room. Duke Sion and his assistant stared at the child, trying to process the birth of such terrifying power. The suffocating tension disappeared in an instant. The boy smiled innocently, acting as if the explosion of dark power had never occurred, which visibly relieved Sephia as she caught her breath. In the young man's mind, however, the gears were turning. He imagined himself as a formidable warrior, visualizing that dark energy as the perfect armor to face monsters in future battles. Back in reality, he wasted no time. The protagonist looked at Duke Sion expectantly, taking advantage of the moment of calm to make a new request, ignoring the fear he had just caused. With calculated childish charm, he asked if he could try the other items in the store. His eyes sparkled and his cheeks flushed, making it almost impossible for the adults to refuse his wish. The adults were caught off guard by the abrupt change in attitude. Sephia sighed, exhausted by the emotional roller coaster, while the Duke agreed, feeling awkward in the face of that sudden enthusiasm. With permission finally granted, the heavy atmosphere in the store dissipated. The boy thanked them with genuine joy, ready to explore the rest of the luxury collection while the Duke watched. Later, the scene changed to the outdoor training ground. The knight Helmut heard the account of recent events, showing shock and confusion at the peculiar story the boy told. The young man described his new acquisition naturally. Helmut, scratching his head while holding his sword, found the situation fascinating, although he clearly didn't know how to react to that strange relic. The boy insisted that the artifact had chosen him, claiming that the shadow clung to him the moment they saw each other. The knight looked at the child skeptically, assessing the danger of that bond. In the courtyard, under the daylight, the boy's small figure contrasted with the darkness of the cloak. Helmut watched carefully, realizing that the garment seemed to have a heavy presence and a life of its own. At the protagonist's feet, the proof was revealed. A pool of darkness formed on the ground, and a small dark entity emerged, displaying a smile full of sharp teeth to the outside world. The boy laughed, casually suggesting that the terrifying creature just wanted to be his friend. Even the shadow monster seemed confused by that innocent interpretation of its predatory nature. Without warning, the young man stomped hard on the ground. He crushed the emerging shadow under the sole of his shoe, forcing the entity to retreat violently before it could fully manifest. While keeping the monster trapped and crushed under his heel, the boy thanked Uncle Helmut with a radiant smile. The contrast between his sweet expression and the physical domination of the shadow was absolute. Helmut, oblivious to the small battle taking place on the ground, smiled back with relief. The knight seemed satisfied, believing in the boy's innocence and ignoring the dangerous nature of his new companion. The young heir made a bold request to his instructor. He no longer wanted basic training, but real combat to test his fighting skills. The knight accepted the challenge with a confident laugh. Energy began to emanate from his sword as he promised to grant the boy's wish. However, the instructor's aura suddenly became oppressive. He scoffed, stating that he would try to restrain himself so as not to intimidate his opponent too much. A sharp smile appeared on the man's face behind the blade. He seemed genuinely entertained by the prospect of testing the boy's limits. The protagonist noticed the provocation and frowned. He knew he couldn't underestimate his opponent's arrogance or strength. Without wasting time, he steadied his stance. Shadows began to stir beneath his feet, responding to his silent command. For the young man, this was not just a duel. The real goal was to train the practical use of the newly acquired shadow cloak in a combat situation. That confrontation would determine the true value of the artifact. He concentrated, letting the dark energy flow freely around him. Invoking the power of darkness, he launched a frontal attack. Blades made of pure shadow advanced rapidly towards the instructor. The knight reacted with brutal precision. With a single sweeping motion of his sword, He blocked and dispersed the dark assault. The boy maintained his focus, watching the result. Even with the attack defended, he needed to maintain control over the unstable magic. The instructor gave no respite. Taking advantage of the gap in the boy's defense, he advanced through the remaining shadows with alarming speed. Announcing his counter-offensive, the man prepared a devastating blow. He brought his sword down with full force, aiming to end the test right there. The protagonist widened his eyes, realizing the imminent danger. The blade was coming too fast for a simple block. He retreated at the last second, using the shadows to slip away. The instructor's blow struck the empty ground with a thunderous impact. The instructor launched into a devastating aerial attack, brandishing his sword with full force. However, the young heir reacted instantly, conjuring shadow spikes to intercept the charge. The impact was brutal and immediate. The knight's heavy gauntlet collided against the magical defense, generating a shockwave that tested the resistance of both. The protagonist, however, did not remain static. He moved with supernatural agility, enveloping himself in darkness to dodge and prepare his next move. The instructor's blade came down again, seeking to break the boy's guard. But the young man responded in kind, creating an explosion of dark energy that stopped the cold steel. The heir focused his will, pushing his magical limits. He knew he needed more intensity to overcome his opponent's combat experience. Suddenly, the ground turned into a dark vortex beneath the adult's feet. The knight, caught completely off guard by the trap, momentarily lost his balance. The man broke out in a cold sweat, a nervous smile escaping his lips. He realized at that moment that the boy in front of him was a real threat and not just a student. Taking advantage of the gap in the enemy's defense, the protagonist went on the offensive. He molded the shadows into a sharp claw, attacking with lethal determination. The instructor barely had time to react to the swift counter-attack. He was forced to raise his sword defensively, blocking the magical blow that could have been fatal. That display of power did not go unnoticed. The other knights present began to murmur among themselves, incredulous at the strength demonstrated by a child. The young man noticed the fixed stares and the surrounding chatter. He interrupted his combat stance, suddenly aware of the unwanted attention he had attracted. The pressure of the moment brought a distant memory to the surface. He recalled a cold night under the moonlight, where his mother promised to intervene with his father. In that memory, the woman held a newborn baby, her face marked with worry. The protagonist, then much smaller, watched the scene with helplessness. The boy felt the anguish of that day again. There was a deep sadness in his childish gaze, aware of the difficulties his family faced. He remembered touching his brother gently. The weight of the duchy's future and the fragility of that new life already rested on his shoulders since then. The young heir watched his sleeping brother with a protective smile. In that moment of peace, he felt the weight of fraternal affection grow in his chest. Before his mother, who held the baby with tenderness, a silent determination took hold of him. The boy wished more than anything to obtain the strength necessary to keep that family safe. The woman smiled gently, noticing the resolution in her son's eyes. That gesture of maternal approval served as fuel for the boy's soul. The moment of departure arrived, bringing with it the reality of duty. The boy approached his mount, ready to leave the comfort of home behind. Already on the horse, he cast one last confident look at his mother. The innocence of childhood mixed with the bravery of someone who was about to face the world. The scene changed to military rigidity, with the troops lined up in the snow. A subordinate informed the Duke that the army was prepared to begin the march. However, the heavy atmosphere next to his father made the boy hesitate for a moment. The grandeur of that military force contrasted with his small stature. One of the knights turned abruptly, surprised by the correction he had heard. He questioned the order, confused about the distinction that was being made. The Duke, maintaining his cold and distant posture, simply looked back. He watched silently, assessing how his son would deal with the insubordination or doubt of his men. The promise that this military elite, the Black Cavalry, would be his in the future echoed in his mind, but the heir was not willing to passively wait for that day. With surprising authority for his age, the boy claimed leadership right there. He declared that this would be his first battle commanding the Knights of Dale. The march ceased when they reached their final destination. The young man and his father stopped side by side, aware that the decisive moment had finally arrived. Behind them, the tension between the soldiers was palpable. The spears were raised and hearts raced, awaiting only the signal for conflict. The heir raised his fist to the sky, taking control of the situation. With a fervent cry, he ordered the proud swords of House Saxon to advance. Responding to the command of their young leader, the cavalry erupted in a devastating charge. The sound of hoofs and war cries filled the air as the army advanced. For that decisive operation, a massive force was mobilized. 250 knights, accompanied by a unit of elite scouts, advanced through the difficult terrain. Meanwhile, oblivious to the military movement, the enemies rested. The monstrous creatures warmed themselves around bonfires, unaware that their position had already been discovered. The command group positioned itself strategically on top of a cliff. They observed the raging current of the river below, aware that they would need to overcome that natural obstacle quickly. Duke Saiyan and the knights made room, heeding the request to retreat. It was time for magic to come into play to pave the way. The young heir lit up immediately upon seeing who was taking the lead. He recognized his master, Sifia, showing great enthusiasm for her presence on the battlefield. The mage unleashed a massive wave of arcane energy. The power of ice erupted before her, instantly freezing the waterfall and river into a solid structure. Sifia precisely controlled the magic, creating a safe bridge where there had only been turbulent waters. She turned to the group, indicating the passage was ready. The troops began to march across the newly formed ice. As the army advanced, the mage remained behind, offering her wishes of victory to the Duke and his men. Before heading into combat, the boy paused his mount for a moment. He exchanged a silent, confident nod with his master, reaffirming the bond between them. The young man then departed, spurring his horse to catch up with the vanguard. Snow flew under the hooves as he distanced himself from the safety of the rear. Sifia watched the small figure move away into the icy landscape. A gentle smile, mixed with a hint of melancholy, appeared on her face. As she watched him leave for battle, she reflected on her own feelings. It was surprising how much that particular student could awaken genuine concern from his master. The army finally positioned itself on the slopes above the valley. Below, the enemy camp remained vulnerable, lit only by sparse bonfires in the darkness. In the shadows of the forest, the archer unit prepared. They drew their bows in unison, with flaming arrows ready to signal the start of the massacre. A rain of fire descended from the skies, illuminating the night. The surprise attack hit the camp violently, catching the creatures completely off guard amidst the blazing chaos. The rain of incendiary arrows fell mercilessly on the camp, turning the silence of the night into a sudden inferno. The enemies were caught completely unawares. Before they could react or understand the origin of the attack, many fell lifeless, pierced amidst the chaos. Duke Saiyan wasted no time admiring the destruction. With absolute authority, he barked the order for his troops to advance to the next phase of the massacre. Obeying promptly, the heavy cavalry organized into a perfect wedge formation, initiating a devastating charge towards the flames. Atop the hill, the Duke, the young heir, and his aide watched the troops advance, awaiting the precise moment to join the vanguard. The boy kept his gaze fixed on the battlefield. Despite his young age, his expression showed no fear, only a cold and calculating concentration. The hunting lance formation, empowered by the knight's aura, tore through the enemy defenses. Not even the orc's brute strength could withstand the supernatural impact. Noticing the tension in the air, the aide next to the boy gave him a confident look, certain that victory was already guaranteed. Duke Saiyan, however, turned to the young man one last time. His words carried a final instruction before they plunged into direct combat. Amidst the panic, the surviving orcs desperately tried to regroup, raising their shields to form a barrier against the approaching death. It was a futile effort. The cavalry collided violently against the defensive line, trampling the creatures and shattering their resistance as if it were made of paper. The Duke himself raised his gloved hand, concentrating magical power to ensure the enemy's disorientation was absolute. A flash of light exploded in the night sky, serving both as a beacon for the allies and as a weapon to blind the opponents. The war horses advanced relentlessly, their hooves trampling the scorched ground and ignoring any obstacle in their path. Faced with that overwhelming force, terror finally took hold of the orcs, who realized too late the magnitude of their imminent defeat. The creature's fury was awakened by the surprise attack. With murderous looks, the orcs prepared to retaliate against the human invasion of their territory. The knight advanced relentlessly, breaking through the enemy lines with his blade. The chaos of battle ensued as the steel of the humans met the flesh of the beasts. However, the war quickly took its toll. An enemy spear found a gap in the defense, piercing the knight and violently tearing him from his saddle. From atop his safe position, the young heir witnessed the fall. He watched the allies' body hit the ground, seeing the reality of combat unfold before him. The boy maintained his composure, but his lips tightened. He processed the brutality of the scene without looking away, hardening his spirit. Behind him, Duke Cyan and his companion merely acknowledged the fact coldly. For the veterans, the fall of a soldier seemed to be just another expected event in battle. On the lower field, the wounded knight desperately tried to recover. However, an orc noticed the vulnerability and ran to execute the fallen human. Unable to accept the inaction, the protagonist turned to the adults. He questioned, with contained indignation, why they were just watching a subordinate's imminent death. The Duke and the mage remained impassive, without lifting a finger. Their silence made it clear that this moment was a test to see how the heir would react. The situation became critical. The monstrous creature quickly gained ground, preparing its weapon to deliver the final blow to the defenseless soldier. The young man realized that intervention depended on him. Calculating the distance, he concluded that he would need exceptional piercing power to penetrate the enemy's tough skin in a single attack. Mentally, he began to restructure his magic. He decided to modify the formula of his ice projectile, adding high-precision properties. To act as a sniper, his eyes shone with the concentration of mana. The boy focused entirely on the target, ignoring the chaos around him to ensure the shot was perfect. A magic circle formed at the tip of his finger. With the formula adjusted and the aim locked, he released the modified spell towards the battlefield. The orc raised his blade for the slaughter, completely unaware of the icy death traveling in his direction to intercept the fatal blow. As Ismail, a bolt of magical energy tore through the skies and struck the ground with devastating precision, interrupting the chaos of battle. Duke Cyan and his companions stopped short, surprised. This sudden intervention was not in their calculations. Ignoring the alarmed shouts of his escort, the young Master Dale jumped off his mount. He decided he wouldn't just watch from a distance. While the knights panicked at the heir's recklessness, the Duke merely smiled. The boy's audacity had finally piqued his interest. Cyan coldly analyzed the impact. That level of destructive power indicated that Dale's magical mastery was far beyond what was expected for a child. The young man, however, remained impassive. His gaze showed no fear, only absolute concentration on the enemy ahead. Before him, a gigantic orc stood tall, imposing among the bodies of the slain soldiers, ready to continue the massacre. Dale positioned himself strategically between the beast and the fallen ally. The confrontation was now inevitable. The wounded knight, dazed and vulnerable, barely noticed that the enemy in the background was already starting a new lethal charge. The young master wasted no time. As he fell, he began to structure his spell, using mathematical logic to simplify and accelerate the conjuration. The soldier watched the creature approach, feeling imminent death. Unaware that salvation was already being prepared, Dale touched his temple, focusing his mind. For him, combat was all about solving a complex equation at the speed of thought. A confident smile appeared on his face. The calculation was complete, and victory was already assured even before the attack. The orc advanced with blind fury against the knight, believing that it would crush its prey without resistance, but the response was immediate. A massive column of magic descended on the creature, obliterating it completely before it could complete the blow. The colossal monster lay defeated, but the knight remained on the ground. The shock on his face was not from the combat, but from the revelation of who had saved him. Light steps landed softly beside him. The young man descended with a calmness that contrasted with the chaos of battle. Dale approached his stunned protector. With reassuring words, he assured him that there was no reason to worry at that moment. The boy smiled, raising his hand to his chest. With nobility, he acknowledged the man's dedication, validating him as a loyal servant in the face of danger. However, the threat had not completely ceased. The knight, still vulnerable, noticed the rapid approach of new enemies from the rear. The beast's fury was evident as they advanced, ignoring the fall of their leader to try to massacre the humans. Dale's friendly expression disappeared in an instant, his eyes fixed on the targets, and the atmosphere around him became charged with offensive magic. He raised his hand, concentrating power on his fingertips. It wasn't just a defense. The young man was preparing a death sentence. A blade of energy cut through the air violently. The impact struck the creatures before they could react, interrupting the charge with brute force. A sinister smile curved the protagonist's lips as he gave a cruel order. A dark entity emerged, ready to feed on the opponents. The dark magic acted as a physical extension of Dale's will. It enveloped and crushed the enemy, destroying it without mercy. The last opponent stopped short, paralyzed by terror. He watched helpless as his companion's grotesque fate was obliterated by the shadow. Dale remained in absolute control, commanding the darkness. The darkness consumed the flesh of the enemies, leaving only clean bones scattered on the ground. As quickly as the murderous aura appeared, it dissipated. The boy's face lit up again with an innocent and radiant smile. With a mischievous wink, he ended the massacre. For Dale, that terrifying display of power seemed like nothing more than a light-hearted joke. The wounded knight stared at the boy, still stunned and sweating cold at the display of power he had just witnessed. The young man, however, remained casual, as if the previous violence was nothing. With an abrupt change in behavior, the protagonist flashed a radiant and innocent smile, completely hiding the murderous aura that had emanated seconds before. To the soldier's absolute shock, the little master lifted him into his arms with frightening ease, demonstrating a physical strength incompatible with his childish appearance. The cavalry reinforcement finally arrived at the gorge. The boy, still carrying his subordinate, addressed the group leader, entrusting him with cleaning up the remaining enemies. The man, whom the young man called Uncle Helmut, rode past them at a gallop, displaying a confident smile as he took control of the battle. Inspired by the heir's presence, the knights of House Cyan advanced with fury against the monsters, shouting in honor of the young master. Later, the adrenaline of combat gave way to the silence of the night. The military camp was set up, carefully guarded by sentinels under the light of torches. Inside the command tent, the atmosphere was oppressive. The boy sat before the Duke, awaiting judgment on his reckless action on the battlefield. The long-haired man maintained a stern and analytical expression, listening to the boy's justifications with evident skepticism. The young man swallowed hard, feeling the weight of that penetrating gaze. The confidence he had displayed during the fight disappeared, replaced by palpable nervousness. The Duke finally broke the silence, beginning to assess the explanation the boy had just given about his powers and decisions. He interlaced his fingers, pondering the boy's words and comparing them to what he knew about the lineage and expected behavior of a noble. A slight smile, devoid of any warmth, curved the man's lips as he prepared his final verdict. With brutal frankness, the Duke declared that the boy's reasoning was weak, dismantling the logic the boy had tried to build. The protagonist reacted with surprise and frustration, gesturing in an attempt to defend his point of view against that cold rejection. The territory of the Northern Demon King, ruled by House Saxon, faced constant hordes of monsters. The Duke carried the weight of this endless defense on his shoulders. Before that imposing figure, the young heir presented himself. He needed to justify his recent actions to his father, aware of the rigid hierarchy that separated them. The Duke's expression remained unchanged, cold and severe. He wasn't there to hear sentimental apologies, but to assess the logic of command. The boy felt the weight of that critical gaze. The tension in the air was suffocating, and he realized that his previous answer had not been enough to appease his father's judgment. The patriarch took a step forward, decreasing the distance between them. The young man lowered his guard, intimidated by the overwhelming presence of the man who commanded the north. The Duke explained the harsh reality of House Saxon. He revealed that he only intervened personally when his subordinates reached their absolute limit and perished. This was the cruel duty they fulfilled. For the family leader, survival was a matter of pragmatism. The boy listened in silence, absorbing the brutal lesson about sacrifice and leadership. Suddenly, the Duke reached out his hand. The unexpected touch on his shoulder made the young man flinch, surprised by the abrupt change in attitude. A rare and approving smile appeared on the father's face. Despite the severity of the lesson, he seemed satisfied that his son had survived and demonstrated worth. The heir released the air he was holding in his lungs, rubbing his forehead. The oppressive atmosphere finally dissipated, leaving him momentarily relieved to have passed the test. With the assessment concluded, the Duke opened the tent flap to the daylight. It was time to return to the castle and leave the battlefield behind. The story of the heroic deed was not long in spreading. Bards enthusiastically narrated how the young heir faced a horde of orcs to save a single knight. The tale quickly became the Empire's favorite rumor. In public squares, the people listened attentively, fascinated by the exaggerated bravery of the noble. In the middle of that crowd, a small hooded figure walked discreetly. The protagonist himself listened to the accounts of his nascent legend. He pulled the hood tightly to hide his embarrassed face. The subtle fame and dramatized versions of his actions were harder to face than the monsters themselves. The young master finally returned to the mansion. The house knights greeted him with a formal bow and voices full of enthusiasm for his arrival. Dale, however, felt embarrassed by such a reception. The heir scratched his face, clearly uncomfortable and shy, with all that sudden attention from his subordinates. The knight in front of him smiled warmly, happy for the boy's safe return. The young man tried to maintain his composure despite the evident embarrassment. Seizing the moment, the man raised his fist and incited his companions. He declared that everyone needed to become even stronger, turning the arrival into a war cry. Determination spread among the soldiers immediately. That vigorous gesture symbolized the union, an unwavering commitment of the troop to protect the ducal house. The heir just smiled weakly, awkwardly in the face of so much martial intensity. In the background, a familiar figure approached to rescue him from that situation. The commotion was interrupted by the arrival of important visitors. The announcement echoed through the courtyard. The guests from House Orhat had arrived for the awaited meeting. The knight noticed the maid's presence and greeted her briefly. The boy's face lit up immediately upon recognizing Eve approaching. All the tension from before disappeared in an instant. The young master displayed a genuine and warm smile, feeling truly relieved to see a friendly face. The mention of House Orhat evoked memories of a golden age. The image of the legendary sword-bearer shone in history as a symbol of unparalleled power. However, that glorious past met a tragic end. During the Unification War, both the kingdom and the divine sword fell, dragging House Orhat into ruin. The instructor seemed lost in those dark memories. He recalled with melancholy the man known as Divine Sword, the one who guided his path in the cavalry. Back in the present, the pair approached a half-open door stealthily. The knight and the boy peeked inside, curious about the atmosphere in the hall. Duke Sayan waited inside, imposing as always. Upon noticing his son's entrance, he went straight to the point, questioning whether the boy had maintained his training discipline. Dale faced his father with a confident smile, not intimidated by the question. Beside him, the knight remained attentive, ready to support the young master before the Duke. A young woman with a striking presence entered the room. walking with firm steps while a maid bowed in silent respect. The protagonist, observing from below, noticed the sudden arrival with cautious curiosity. The woman maintained a deep reverence, demonstrating a submission that contrasted with the haughty and rigid posture of the small visitor. The blonde girl offered a greeting, but her body posture exuded a cold arrogance, ignoring the humility of the maid. The hostility in the girl's eyes intensified rapidly, revealing a contained anger that was about to overflow. Example: the young heir's eyes widened, suddenly noticing the dangerous shift in the room's atmosphere. Unable to contain herself, the girl furiously questioned the reason for such reverence, refusing to accept anyone humbling themselves before that family. The long-haired man, watching the scene, simply made a dismissive gesture with his hand, brushing off the drama. Trying to diffuse the situation diplomatically, the protagonist smiled and gently offered to guide young Lady Charlotte around the castle. He extended his hand in a friendly invitation, hoping that courtesy could break the ice between them. However, the girl's expression twisted into pure revulsion at the sight of his friendly gesture. She violently struck the boy's hand away, yelling at him never to dare touch her, rejecting any closeness. The young man recoiled, stunned, confused by the sudden aggression, and not understanding the source of such hatred. The girl seemed trapped in a trauma, reaching out to painful memories of her family and figures from the past. In her memories, the imperial royalty watched her with coldness and contempt, fueling the resentment she now projected onto the nobles before her. The young girl abruptly turned her back, coldly ending the interaction. The older woman, who was watching the scene, sensed the immediate tension between the two children. Faced with the awkward silence, the lady prepared to speak, feeling the need to intervene. The girl didn't hesitate and began to walk away quickly. The young heir remained still, confused by the sudden hostility he had just received. She hurried through the doors of the hall, fleeing the environment as if she couldn't bear to stay there for another second. The mother was left with the task of calming things down. She bowed respectfully before those present, begging forgiveness for her daughter's impulsive and rude behavior. The Duke maintained his impenetrable posture as he listened. The woman, visibly distressed, tried to explain the reasons behind that defensive attitude. She mentioned the recent rise of Count Brandenburg, a new supervisor whose appointment cast shadows over their lives. The lady's expression turned grave. There was a sordid reason why that man was despised and feared in social circles. Rumors said that he was obsessed with creating a powerful lineage, seeking skilled swordswomen only to generate talented heirs, treating them as mere instruments. It was a threat that hung over the young swordswoman's head. The mother trembled at the thought of the fate that awaited her daughter in the hands of such a man. Duke Sayan absorbed the information in calculating silence. The woman, with a pleading look, revealed the desperation of her current situation. She admitted that as a member of a fallen noble house, her resources and influence were insufficient to offer the necessary protection. The purpose of that visit became clear. She begged for a barrier, anything that would prevent that man from ever laying hands on her daughter again. Outside, away from the adults' heavy conversation, young Charlotte stopped short upon hearing her name being called. The protagonist had followed her to the courtyard. Scratching his head awkwardly, he tried a new approach, ignoring the previous rejection. The young heir tried a friendly approach, offering a genuine smile to dispel the previous tension. He hoped a calm conversation could resolve the misunderstanding without the need for further conflict. Charlotte, however, kept her distance, walking with firm steps through the snow. Her posture radiated a cold hostility, making it clear that kind words would not be enough to reach her. Suddenly, the girl spun around violently. The air hissed as she delivered a swift blow, cutting the space between them with an aggressiveness that left no room for doubt. The blade stopped pointed directly at his chest. It wasn't just an empty threat. She issued a formal challenge, demanding that he prove his worth through combat if he wanted to be heard. Determination burned in Charlotte's eyes as she shouted her conditions. She refused to accept his kindness, demanding to see the true strength that the boy hid. The protagonist recoiled slightly, caught off guard by the girl's sudden intensity. That nervous smile betrayed that he didn't expect the situation to escalate to a duel so quickly. A heavy silence descended on the training yard. The tension between the two grew, filling the void left by unspoken words as the snow fell around them. They took their positions on the white field, facing each other as adversaries. The challenge had been tacitly accepted. Now, only the clash of swords could resolve the impasse. Dale's nervousness disappeared, giving way to a sharp confidence. He summoned his own blade, deciding that if she wanted a demonstration of power, he wouldn't disappoint her. Memories of past battles and his true nature surfaced. He decided that this would be the perfect opportunity to prove to the world, and to her, that he was much stronger than he appeared. Charlotte noticed the drastic change in his aura. The harmless boy from moments ago had disappeared, replaced by someone who understood the gravity of real combat. Both planted their feet in the snow, calculating the distance and studying each other's openings. Casual training had turned into a serious test of skills. Analyzing the girl's impeccable posture, Dale glimpsed something extraordinary. The imposing image of a legendary holy swordsman seemed to overlap with Charlotte's small figure, revealing her latent potential. That realization made the protagonist grit his teeth, mixing caution and excitement. He realized that underestimating her technique, even as a child, would be a dangerous mistake. Charlotte didn't hesitate for another second. With a fluid and swift movement, she advanced against him, initiating the duel with a precise thrust that aimed to test the Heir's reflexes. The protagonist ran through the snowy field toward the girl. He didn't hesitate, even seeing that she was already waiting for him in a fighting stance. Dale smiled, amused by the sudden hostility. He drew his own blade, showing that he would not back down from the threat. With an open guard, the young man provoked his opponent. He demanded that she use all her strength without holding back. Charlotte's expression hardened at the challenge. Energy began to emanate from her weapon as she channeled her fury into the attack. A beam of green light cut through the air in an instant. The blow was struck with impressive speed, aiming to hit the target immediately. The Heir reacted in time, intercepting the thrust. The impact of the metal reverberated as he blocked the frontal assault. However, that was just the first move. Charlotte unleashed a storm of blows, forcing Dale to retreat under the overwhelming pressure. She attacked with relentless ferocity. Her eyes shone with intensity, determined to break through the boy's defense at any cost. The protagonist gritted his teeth, struggling to keep up with the frantic pace. Each defense required precise reflexes to avoid being cut. The blades collided violently once again. The physical strength behind her blows was surprising for someone of her size. Charlotte retreated momentarily. Enveloped in a visible aura, she was raising the level of combat, using real power in her movements. The brief distancing allowed both to reassess. Dale maintained his stance, watching carefully as she prepared her next attack. The clash resumed with even more vigor. The girl took advantage of the moment to create space and change the dynamics of the fight. With a confident smile, she prepared a precise attack. The aura around her sword indicated that the next blow would be decisive. Charlotte jumped, using gravity to her advantage. Dale looked up, preparing to receive the impact of the aerial attack descending upon him. The clash of blades echoed through the courtyard. Charlotte charged fiercely, forcing the young man to block the direct impact of her attack. Her mind, however, wandered to a distant memory. Her mother was by her side, watching over her sleep with a comforting smile during her days of illness. The gentle touch of that hand brought peace. At that time, fragility was her only companion, and maternal affection seemed to be the only protection against the world. However, the girl refused to remain weak. She decided to transform that fragile body into a weapon, striking the training dummy repeatedly until exhaustion. Sweat dripped and muscles burned with the effort. Each breath was a struggle, but the determination in her eyes never wavered in the face of pain. Over time, physical sacrifice turned into real power. Mana began to flow around her, responding to the unwavering desire to become stronger. Back in the present, the protagonist noticed the change in rhythm. He dodged with precision, noting the heavy, emotional charge behind each of her movements. Charlotte gave no respite. She advanced again through the snowy courtyard, crossing the distance between them in the blink of an eye to maintain the pressure. With a scream that released all her accumulated frustration, she jumped, gravity and strength combined in a descending blow, designed to crush his defense. The young heir did not back down. He stood his ground and brandished his sword upwards, intercepting her blade with a fluid and powerful movement. The physical impact seemed to awaken something deeper. A sudden touch on her shoulder broke the trance of battle, paralyzing her movements. Charlotte's emotional barriers finally crumbled. Tears overflowed as she brought her hand to her head, unable to contain the despair that overwhelmed her. The protagonist remained still, watching the scene with surprise. The imposing figure of the swordswoman gave way to a girl trembling before her own memories. An internal voice tormented her cruelly. The conviction that she was unable to protect her home from that man consumed her in tears and guilt. Upon understanding, Charlotte remained motionless in the snow, trembling with frustration. The end of the combat brought no relief, only the bitter realization of her own weakness in the face of the opponent. The tears finally overflowed, betraying her attempt to maintain composure. The young woman felt the weight of impotence crush her heart. Unable to contain the emotion that overwhelmed her, her mind retreated to the past, remembering the words that defined her path. She recalled the promise to wait until she had enough strength to win her battles on her own. It was at that moment that the young heir intervened. With a confident smile, he offered not only a weapon, but the absolute protection of his house as a shield for her. He extended the ceremonial sword towards her. That gesture represented an offer of power and partnership that the little girl never expected to receive. The girl wiped away her tears, replacing sadness with determination. She accepted the destiny that was offered to her, committing to fight for him and for his family. A genuine smile lit up her face. The connection between the two strengthened there, transforming gratitude into unbreakable loyalty. She knelt in the snow, submitting to the improvised ritual. The boy, with solemnity, granted her the title of knight, sealing the pact between master and servant. The young woman's expression hardened with seriousness. In that instant, the fragility of childhood was left behind in favor of the duty she had just assumed. Her small hands tightened their grip on the golden hilt. The weight of the sword seemed to anchor her promise, making the oath tangible and real. Beneath the winter sky, the oath was completed. The vast white landscape witnessed the moment she dedicated her life to protecting the one who took her in. The memory shifted to the Duke's office. The protagonist stood before his father, bringing the formal request to officialize his new guardian's position. The patriarch of House Saxon listened attentively. He pondered the petition involving Lady Orhat, calculating the risks and benefits of that unusual appointment. Seated at his imposing desk, the man made his decision. He addressed his son, agreeing to the arrangement, but maintaining an aura of unquestionable authority. However, the Duke's gaze suddenly narrowed. His eyes gleamed with a dangerous intensity, suggesting he saw far beyond a child's simple request. Duke Sean questioned the veracity of the boy's words, watching him from his desk with a penetrating gaze. The atmosphere in the office was heavy and demanded absolute honesty. Far from being intimidated, the young heir smiled confidently. He placed his hand on his chest, reaffirming his position and intentions without hesitating before the Duke's authority. Charlotte listened to everything in silence, her serious expression betraying the tension of the moment. She knew that this conversation would define much about the future and the role they would play. The Duke explained the weight of the responsibility that fell upon the family. He spoke of a divine sword, a force that should be wielded exclusively for the good and protection of the duchy. A satisfied smile appeared on Saijon's face. The response or the demonstrated attitude seemed to have pleased the head of the house, suggesting that the test had been passed. The protagonist maintained eye contact, his eyes shining with determination. He understood the expectations imposed and was ready to accept the challenge entrusted to him. Night fell over the ducal residence, enveloping the stone towers in shadows. However, While some planned for the future, the tension elsewhere was about to explode. The sound of shattering glass broke the quiet. A glass was thrown violently against the floor, scattering the dark liquid as if it was spilled blood. In another office, an older noble trembled with rage. He leaned over the table, glaring furiously at the hooded figure who brought him bad news. He punched the surface of the table hard, unable to contain his frustration. His authority was being challenged, and his patience had completely run out. While the subordinate kept his head down in submission, the man paced back and forth. The incompetence of his agents was something he could not tolerate. The noble gritted his teeth, the vein throbbing in his temple. The situation was getting out of his control, and fury clouded his rational judgment. Muttering insults about the uselessness of his men, he walked towards the stand where an ornate sword rested. Words were no longer enough. His hand gripped the weapon's hilt firmly. The decision to punish failure with immediate violence was made in an instant of anger. He grabbed the subordinate by the neck, suffocating him brutally. Fear was etched on the man's face as he stared at the lethal threat in his enraged master's eyes. The noble raised the gleaming blade, immediately recognizing the legendary Durandal sword. A gleam of covetousness lit up his face as he held such power. His obsession became palpable as he admired his reflection in the metal. He whispered to the weapon as if it were a lover, asking it to wait just a little longer. Turning to the hooded figure waiting in the shadows, the man prepared to give his orders. Possession of the sword seemed to have accelerated his plans. With a maniacal grin, he reached out towards the subordinate. The greed in his eyes made it clear that he would not accept failures in his next demand. Far away, in a silent library, the young blonde struggled against piles of books. She realized, with some frustration, that local knowledge differed drastically from that of Teutonia. The scene changed to the snow-covered training ground. The instructor positioned himself between the protagonist and the girl, setting the stage for a direct confrontation. The young heir wielded his training sword with confidence. A challenging smile appeared on his lips, demonstrating that he did not fear the imminent duel. On the other hand, the girl assumed her posture with absolute seriousness. Her eyes focused on the opponent, analyzing every movement without any trace of playfulness. The instructor, satisfied with the tension in the air, smiled. He knew that this would be the perfect moment to test the progress of both students. At the starting signal, the two children advanced simultaneously. The clash of their weapons was immediate, releasing sparks and energy into the cold air. The protagonist moved with agility, attacking with quick blows. He seemed to enjoy the combat, maintaining pressure on his opponent. However, the girl was not intimidated. She brandished her foil with refined technique, intercepting the attack with impressive precision. The air then accelerated, leaving a trail of bluish energy. He tried to use his superior speed to flank her defense in a sudden movement, but she reacted instantly. With sharp reflexes, the young woman blocked the attack, proving that her combat reading was up to his speed. The instructor watched attentively as the two finished the movement with their blades crossed. Both stared at each other, measuring strengths in a stalemate that revealed each other's promising talent. Duke Saon watched the confrontation, questioning whether this could even be called a duel between children. The gravity of the situation was evident. The speed and lethal intent of the blows were remarkable. This far exceeded what would be expected of simple children's training. He maintained his position, analyzing each movement. The man knew he was witnessing the birth of exceptional warriors. The young heir advanced with determination. His eyes searched for an opening, focused only on breaking through his opponent's defense. With a sudden movement, he launched a surprise attack. The attack was quick enough to catch the girl off guard. Charlotte reacted out of pure instinct. Her reflexes were tested to the limit as she tried to intercept the approaching blade. Before the fatal blow occurred, the Duke intervened. He blocked the attack and ended the fight, praising both of their excellent work. The girl stopped immediately, still holding her weapon. The sudden interruption left her momentarily confused, processing the end of the duel. Her father looked at the two of them with undisguised pride. The tension of combat dissipated before his warm approval. Charlotte lowered her guard. The Duke's imposing presence served as a reminder that the training had in fact ended. The young heir also relaxed his posture. The ferocity in his eyes disappeared, replaced by the calm of someone who had fulfilled their duty. The Duke recalled the final moment of the clash. The firmness with which they planted their feet on the ground demonstrated perfect balance. The image of the fierce determination in Charlotte's eyes remained in his mind. She hadn't backed down for even a second. However, something made the Duke ponder. He touched his chin, reflectively, assessing the implications of that frightening talent he had just witnessed. Charlotte, on the other hand, didn't seem satisfied. She looked away with a disgruntled expression, frustrated by the forced draw. The instructor questioned the technique used, but soon reassured the girl. The tense atmosphere of the previous training quickly dissipated. He laughed openly, admitting that he was just teasing the young lady. Her seriousness during combat, he said, was too adorable not to be tested. Charlotte, however, remained sulky about the joke, while receiving a pat on the head. The protagonist watched the scene, noting the girl's silent frustration at this condescension. The young man's mind, however, focused on another type of power. He recalled the teachings about feeling the flow of mana passing through the heart and stabilizing it in the body. Later, before his magic instructor, the progress was revealed. The elf was stunned to realize that he had already completed the complex formation of his second circle. The energy flowed and manifested visually. The mana circle spun with a stability and complexity that defied logic for someone his age. He mentally compared his performance to the average. While ordinary mages struggled to reach 300 rotations, his control over the first and second circles already operated at absurdly higher levels. Satisfied with the numbers, the young man began to plan the next step. With that rotational capacity, he realized he could modify the very nature of basic spells. He focused the energy on his fingertips. The goal was to take the simple ice bullet and completely restructure it. Visualizing the molecular structure, he condensed the magic. The focus was on drastically increasing the mass and hardness of the projectile, transforming it into something much denser. Aiming at a nearby tree, he applied the final concept. He imagined a large caliber cannon to add extreme rotation and supersonic speed to the shot. The spell was released. A beam of bluish light cut through the air violently, propelled by the centrifugal force generated by his mana circles. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. The tree was not only hit, but obliterated by an explosion of kinetic energy and ice that swept the area. When the cloud of debris settled, only a gigantic hole remained in the landscape. The young man and his instructor observed the result of that basic modification. The elf, enchanted by such a demonstration of power, applauded with a radiant smile. The boy, however, remained impassive, facing the destruction as a simple result of his calculations. The elven instructor observed her pupil, but her usual stern expression gave way to a look of genuine tenderness. The young heir, however, did not understand the sudden change. This unexpected behavior left him visibly confused and intrigued. Without any warning, she pulled him into a warm hug. The spontaneous gesture caught the boy completely off guard in the middle of the snow. Dale's face burned with shame. He remained still, stunned by the display of affection he rarely received. The next day, at dawn, the scene changed to the ducal courtyard. The protagonist was alone, ready for a rigorous practical test. He summoned his mana and commanded the ground. Immediately, an imposing wall of ice rose in front of him, serving as a target for the exercise. With the defense established, the young man extended his hand. It was time to test whether his offensive power could overcome his own barrier. He visualized the complex structure of a modern munition. The spell took shape, condensing the ice into multiple high-impact projectiles. The attack was released. Dozens of ice fragments shot out at high speed, tearing through the air towards the static target. The impact was violent. Each projectile hit the barrier with brute force, shattering the frozen surface into a shower of crystals. The defense didn't hold. The bombardment pierced and demolished the ice wall completely, demonstrating a destructive power far above normal. As the remains of the ice fell, Dale relaxed his posture. It was then that he felt a presence watching him nearby. A silver-haired girl was standing there holding a training sword. She seemed to have arrived in the middle of the demonstration. Upon realizing that she had been noticed, the girl timidly tried to retreat behind a tree. The young heir turned, facing the little intruder. She was in shock. The girl's eyes shone with a mixture of astonishment and admiration at the overwhelming power she had just witnessed. Examel Dale observed the girl in front of him with an unreadable expression, assessing the situation. The white-haired young woman holding her sword reacted with frustration and obvious nervousness to his attitude. The heir, however, merely pondered in silence, momentarily ignoring the girl's panic. To break the tension, the boy flashed a bright and disarming smile, changing the mood of the conversation. Later, under the night sky, he suggested they abandon the rigid formalities between them, seeking closeness. As they walked through the snowy forest, the girl confessed how much she liked the frigid climate. Dale kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, listening attentively to her words. She, in turn, watched him with a discreet smile, showing appreciation for his silent company. Leaning against the trunk of an old tree, the two enjoyed the tranquility and peace of that shared moment. The vastness of the forest seemed to isolate them from the outside world, making time pass too quickly for both. From inside the mansion, a couple watched the children in the distance through the window, reflecting on their youth. The woman watched the scene with a loving smile, touched by the innocent interaction she witnessed outside. Back in the forest, Dale seemed to have finally made a firm decision about what he needed to do next. The kindness of that maternal figure extended beyond the walls of the mansion, helping those in need in the city. With her usual gentleness, she gave food to the poor, genuinely concerned about their well-being. Dale walked calmly through the city streets, holding a freshly bought loaf of bread. The young noblewoman right behind, however, seemed out of place and hesitant in that common environment. Suddenly, the calm was broken when a street child appeared and grabbed the girl's arm. The sudden movement caught them both by surprise. The young woman froze, visibly uncomfortable with the sudden contact. She didn't know how to react to such a direct and invasive approach. The boy, with a dirty face and tears in his eyes, pleaded desperately. His attitude seemed like that of someone who had no one else to turn to. However, the situation exuded a hidden danger. The scenario seemed staged, and Dale's intuition warned him that it was too suspicious to be a coincidence. Without losing a second, the young heir sprang into action. His combat instincts took over, propelling him forward with explosive speed. He ran, not towards the boy, but focusing on the threats that were hiding above. Dale knew they were being watched from the rooftops. Atop a building, a hidden observer tensed up. He realized with astonishment that his stealthy presence had been detected by the target. Back in the alley, the tension increased. Dale positioned himself defensively, while the street boy looked terrified at what was about to happen. The ambush was revealed when armed men surrounded the group. They mocked the noble children's recklessness for walking unprotected in such a dangerous place. Dale protectively placed himself in front of the girl. While she showed nervousness and indignation, he maintained a defiant smile on his face. One of the assassins displayed his dagger with a sadistic look. He was confident that dealing with two children would be an easy and quick task. Dale's smile, however, was not one of naivety. It was the cold expression of someone who knew exactly what he was capable of and was not afraid of confrontation. With firmness, Dale declared his identity and made a solemn oath. He promised to protect the daughter of the Orhard house against those criminals, no matter the cost. The bandits laughed at the boy's bravado. They completely underestimated the danger they were in when facing the Scion heir. The assassins surrounded the children, displaying their blades with mocking smiles. They believed it would be an easy and quick job against two seemingly unprotected young nobles. The heir, however, calmly placed himself in front of the girl, creating a barrier between her and the attackers. Despite the obvious numerical disadvantage, his posture showed no sign of panic. He turned briefly to his companion, offering a reassuring smile amidst the tension. In a soft voice, he assured her that she didn't need to fear, as he had the situation under control. As soon as the enemies advanced, Dale coldly declared that this would be considered self-defense. The time for conversation was over. Combat was now inevitable. The attackers charged simultaneously, coming from the ground and the rooftops, trying to overwhelm the boy with a coordinated attack. They did not intend to leave any escape route for their victims. To the assassin's surprise, their blades only met empty air. Dale moved with a supernatural fluidity, dodging each lethal blow as if dancing among the shadows. Frustration overcame one of the aggressors, who shouted in fury as he saw his attacks fail repeatedly. He put all his brute strength into a new desperate blow. However, the young heir's gaze remained cold and calculating. His eyes shone intensely, tracking every enemy movement with frightening precision. Shadows erupted from the ground around Dale, suddenly materializing as sharp weapons. The surprise counterattack caught the mercenaries completely off guard in the middle of their charges. Fear replaced arrogance on the man's face as the darkness reached him. He tried to retreat and deny the impending fate, but the shadows were faster than his reflexes. Irremal dark energy enveloped the attacker, crushing him against the ground with overwhelming pressure. The heir's hidden strength proved far greater than anyone there expected. The gang leader watched, stunned and sweating, as his companions were neutralized. The certainty of an easy victory had turned into an instant nightmare. Dale didn't stop there and intensified his power. He summoned an even greater mass of darkness, which rose behind him, distorting the air with an evil energy. The shadow took on a monstrous form and let out a terrifying screech that echoed through the alley. Before that abyssal creature, the young man remained impassive, like a master commanding death itself. The last assassin standing was paralyzed by pure terror at the sight. He finally understood that he had made a fatal mistake in choosing that target. The assassins didn't hesitate. Obeying the order to kill immediately, they advanced in a coordinated attack, trying to overwhelm the target with numerical superiority. Dale, however, maintained his composure. He held his weapon firmly, his eyes carefully tracking every enemy movement, as he calculated the exact moment to react. With a subtle shift in weight, the young man secured his footing. He was ready to turn defense into motion the instant the first blow approached. The alley became a blur of motion. Dale moved with supernatural agility, dodging between the attackers and causing the enemy blades to cut only air. He wasn't just running away. Infusing his blade with aura, the protagonist counterattacked, his precise strikes cutting through the assassin's offense in the confined space. Seizing the moment, the heir jumped. The shadows seemed to respond to his call, enveloping him as he prepared a devastating aerial assault. His landing was light and calculated. Magic pulsed beneath his feet, propelling him with a speed that the mercenaries simply couldn't match. The atmosphere changed abruptly. Spheres of energy manifested around Dale, signaling that he had stopped testing the enemies and was ready to use lethal force. A magic circle illuminated the stone floor. With a quick gesture, he activated the arcane trap he had prepared, catching his opponents completely off guard. The impact was brutal. An energy blade erupted from the ground, launching one of the attackers violently into the air and destroying any chance of defense. Hidden behind the wall, the girl watched everything in shock. The violence and power demonstrated by her protector were far more terrifying than she could imagine. The combat had turned into a massacre. While Dale remained relentless, his shadow construct emerged to hunt down the remaining enemies. The last assassin standing trembled uncontrollably. Clutching his wounded chest, he realized too late that they weren't facing an ordinary noble, but a monster. Dale's expression was cold and predatory. There was no mercy in his gaze, only the dark satisfaction of someone who completely dominated the situation. The shadows obeyed Dale's command, keeping the enemy suspended and helpless. The young man walked through the scene of destruction with a calm that contrasted with the chaos around him. Ignoring the finished battle, he turned his attention to who really mattered. In a soft tone, he called the girl's name to bring her back to reality. Charlotte, however, remained on the ground, unable to process what she saw. The fear in her eyes made it clear that her savior's violence terrified her as much as the assassins themselves. Dale reached out to comfort her, ignoring the knights who arrived late to the courtyard. The newcomers stopped short, shocked to find the massacre already resolved by a single child. But the young man's mercy had clear limits. A brusque movement interrupted any sense of security, signaling that the final judgment was still underway. The last assassin screamed for help as he was devoured by darkness. Dale simply positioned himself in front of Charlotte, blocking her view of that cruel fate. In a last act of desperation, the man crawled and offered information. He promised to reveal everything he knew, believing that his secrets would be worth his life. The mercenary forced a nervous smile, sweat dripping down his face. He was sure that the boy's curiosity would be his salvation at that critical moment. The answer came in the form of a brutal and definitive blow. Without hesitation, Dale crushed the enemy's head, silencing the offer before it could even be considered. The young heir watched the lifeless body with total indifference. He made it clear that he had no interest whatsoever in what those men had to say. 爱说撒谎